Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. My name is Scott Daly, and I am your host and constant reader.
And I'm Matt Freeman, and I'm the fucking heartbroken King newbie over here.
Oh gosh, Matt. This week on the show, we are reading the first two chapters of part 3 in this haze of green and gold, aka Ves Kagan. It's a race against time as Roland, Jake, and Oy rush to prevent the death of Stephen King. They succeed, but at a terrible price. Another of Roland's companions falls. Matt, what did you think about this week's cheery reading?
Oh, it's just great, you son of a bitch. Because this is all your elaborate revenge for the Worm podcast, huh?
It was.
Sucked me in and dragged me over the broken glass of loss and pain. And yeah, I mean, there's some incredibly beautiful writing in this week. And obviously some very harrowing moments. A lot of interestingly funny moments too, as I think we'll talk about. Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. What did you think?
I mean, the hardest part of recording last week's episode was having to pretend that I didn't know this was coming. Right. So, I mean, like I last week was certainly tragic in its own right, but like there was very much a sense, at least that I got from you, that, okay, we've gone through this tragedy. Now let's move on. And then it just hits you right again so soon. I mean, sometimes I forget how soon after Eddie's death it is that Jake dies. And it's 2 chapters. That's it. And I didn't remember going into this book, but I looked a few weeks ago in preparation, knowing we were coming to this. And I was shocked to see that it was going to be the next week for us, just the way we space things out. So I was dreading this, and it was very hard to not like reveal that it was coming and coming so fast when we were talking, because it certainly does come really fast here.
Yeah. I mean, I think King creates an interesting effect here because it's the same effect that he has on his character, Roland, where basically Roland experiences this terrible loss. He's grieving, and like before he can, practically take a breath, he's hit by another one. And and that's the effect. Like if I had been reading the way I normally read, I would have experienced probably both of these deaths in like the same sitting,
Yeah.
And he definitely did that on purpose, right? Like he could have written the book in such a way that the deaths were spread out more, but I think he's going for a certain effect of just making you almost numb to the idea of it. I'm going to have more to say about that, but like when you take 2 characters away in such rapid succession, it actually, in my opinion, creates a little bit of a distance, actually, where you're like, oh, you're just going to do this to me then. Okay, then I am going to psychologically, distance myself a little bit from this. I don't know if you do the same thing, but I mean, one thing I was kind of going to save this comment for the end, but I'll post it here and then maybe we can loop back around to it. But I was sort of comparing to like, everyone knows that the character Tasha Yar dies in one of the early seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation, and it's like one of the only times that like a bridge crew character has ever died in a Star Trek show, so it's a piece of trivia. But I was reflecting like, okay, well, what if they had done that and then like the next week they killed Worf? Like you would be like, oh, so we're just killing people now. Okay, I get it. Like this is like we've shifted modes, right? And that's kind of what this felt like to me, where it was like, oh, we're not just telling this story anymore. We're really accelerating toward a finish line, and I can look forward to a lot of really kind of devastating things happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, and I know what you mean by you kind of like automatically put your guard up. You start to protect yourself mentally because you this is coming, and it's coming in waves. I mean, I think when we were talking about this earlier, I compared it to kind of a hurricane, right? Where like the hurricane blows through and the wind's blowing one direction and like nails your house really hard. And then there's this slight pause when you're in the eye, and then the other part of the hurricane passes you by and the wind's going in the other direction. And that's actually in a hurricane when most of the damage is done, is when the wind suddenly changes direction and things that were pushed one way are suddenly flung back the other way. And that's when things rip up and rip off. And that's what this felt like to me, is that like you brace for the hurricane, you know Eddie's death is coming, you get through it, and then there's this pause, and then bam, from out of nowhere this next one comes, and you're just not ready for it. And that's like, it hits you hard. It hits Roland hard. It hits everything hard. It's a 1-2 punch that just knocks you to the floor.
Yeah. And I mean, one more comment here at the beginning is like, I think at different times I basically predicted, like, you were like, who's going to die? And I'm pretty sure that I was like, at one point or another was like, I think everybody's going to die except Jake. It's basically what I said.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
And then when Susanna died, I was like, when
geez,
I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? No, I have no idea if that's going to happen or not. But when Eddie died, I was like, oh, okay, that was actually less painful than I expected, weirdly. And then just in the sense that I actually thought more characters were going to die, but then I was premature in my comfort in that. So
sure.
Yeah, it's just really interesting way of doing it. I mean, deaths in fiction are, well, how to say it? Like, the better the book is, the harder the death hits you. So
sure,
I think it speaks to what a good series of books this is, that not only can King really break your heart with Eddie's death, but he can then break your heart again so quickly afterward with Jake's death without really kind of breaking you out of the story.
Yeah, totally. So let's dive into it, huh? Let's get started.
Yeah.
We've kind of prefaced our conversation with how sad we're going to be, and now we have to deal with it.
Sounds good.
So we're going to begin the first chapter of this section. It's called Mrs. Tassenbaum Drives South. And we're going to have a lot to say about Mrs. Tassenbaum, Matt. She's a wonderful character that I can't wait to talk about. But before we get there, we have to start with this opening paragraph. And I actually just want to read this because I think this is really clever what King is doing here. And I'm kind of glad that things worked out, that we see Jake's death in this week's episode, because I think what King is doing in this opening paragraph becomes very clear in that perspective. So the chapter opens with, the fact of his own almost unearthly speed of hand never occurred to Jake Chambers. All he knew was that when he staggered out of the Devar toy and back into America, his shirt, bellied out into a pregnant curve by Oi's weight, was pulling out of his jeans. The bumbler, who never had much luck when it came to passing between worlds, he'd nearly been squashed by a taxicab the last time, tumbled free. Almost anyone else in the world would have been unable to prevent the fall, and in fact, it would have very likely wouldn't have hurt Oi at all. But Jake wasn't almost anyone. Ka had wanted him so badly that it even had found a way around his death to put him on at Roland's side. Now his hand shot out with a speed so great that they momentarily blurred away to nothing. When they reappeared, one was curled into the thick shag at the nape of Oi's neck, and the other into the shorter fur at the rump end of his long back. Jake set his friend down on the pavement. Oi looked up at him and gave a single short bark. It seemed to express not one idea, but two. Thanks, and don't do that again.
I love it when Oi's behavior reminds me of like looks that my dog would give me when I was a kid.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think, as we were talking about, reading this, knowing what happens to Jake in one short chapter, I think makes it like brilliant and cruel what he's doing here. King is like very much knows he's about to kill Jake, and he's kind of doing this very quick reestablishment game to remind us of certain attributes of Jake. He reminds us of how quick he is, of how fast he can move when he needs to, something that he doesn't even think about himself. And though we'll get to see how that speed is used to save Stephen King. He reminds us of he and Oi's relationship. He reminds us of the fact that Jake has died multiple times throughout the story, but the story was not done with him yet. That Ka wanted him. It needed him for something else. So King is doing all of this in the short opening paragraph that is going to pay off in just one chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's even priming you with these images of like, reminding you that the last time Jake stepped into New York, he almost got hit by a taxi cab. Like, yeah. Oi almost got hit by a car. Jake has been hit by a car. We're sort of like, it's a subconscious priming effect, but he's definitely drawing your mind to imagine Jake being hit by a car.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then of course, what you said about Ka needing him, the story needed him, right? And now the story doesn't need him anymore. In fact, the story specifically needs to be rid of him, because I think we're now on a path toward regressing Roland in certain ways. I think we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in order to do that, the story needs to get rid of Jake. The story needs to kill Jake. I found myself thinking a lot this week about how, like, this is the Roland that we know is the Roland toward the end of a long life's journey.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't the first group of friends that he's lost. For him, losing all of his friends again is a kind of return to the pattern. It's a return to where we met him at the beginning of the story. I don't know why exactly. It just seemed like there were a lot of moments where this was occurring to me. Like, oh, this is Roland from the Gunslinger. I think maybe part of it is because this is basically just him and Jake. I mean, always there, but like when it's him and Jake, you're like, oh, that's when was the last time this happened? Basically, okay. Well, there's probably a time between now and then, but the point is, just Roland and Jake makes you immediately think of the Gunslinger.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think King is doing that intentionally. I mean, we talked about this last week that Eddie was. I think we were so bold as to say Eddie made the Dark Tower what the Dark Tower was, and the books did not become the Dark Tower until Eddie entered the story, and now we've taken him out of the story. And as we kind of touched on last week, we've taken Susanna out of the story too. She's not dead, but she's not here for this. She's gone, and so we have Eddie taken away from us, and then Susanna is also taken away from us, and Oy is here. Yes, we can't forget about our little Billy Bumbler, but this is the section that is just father and son, Jake and Roland, and it is very reminiscent of the Dark Tower or of the Gunslinger, and it will continue to be so after Jake is taken away from us as well.
Yeah.
I think that thing that you're feeling, I think you're absolutely supposed to. I think that's what King is doing here. We've kind of talked about how the books are kind of rhyming a little bit. We've talked about that in the past, and this is the moment I was thinking about when you talked about that earlier in the story. That's like, yeah, you're catching on to something here, and it becomes more and more obvious as we go along.
Yeah, I think toward the end of this is where it becomes the most obvious, and we'll talk about that when we get there.
Sure. So as we mentioned last week, our characters are back in the same general store that Eddie and Roland were ambushed in. Jake even smells old Took's general store just like Eddie did when he first came here, which really is just Stephen King like turning the knife a bit into us. I don't know, like I felt the absence of Eddie a lot when reading this week's, especially because King has returned us to a place where Eddie was last time, and a mission where Eddie, like there, I don't know if you remember, you probably do because it wasn't that long ago, but when Eddie and Roland were racing through Maine and the story went goofy for a while, like there was the whole Mayo looking like jizz part where it was back to a very kind of silly fish out of water Roland character, and now Roland has returned to this place with Jake and not Eddie, and the tone is so different. And obviously the tone's different because the stakes are really high right now because there's a race against time, like things are moving very fast. That's why the tone is different, but also it's because Eddie's not here. I just really felt the loss of him in this opening chapter a lot.
I agree. There's an absence that's strongly felt there. And you can't help but feel like things would have gone differently if Eddie were here. Like,
sure.
You know, that you think of the quartet as a group of people whose strengths and weaknesses all kind of perfectly intermesh to create this effective unit where the strengths compensate for the weaknesses and everyone supports each other. And now Eddie is gone and the Tet is broken. Like that's what it means for the Tet to be broken. You know, Susanna isn't here. So there's no intermeshing. There's no compensating for weaknesses. Like you feel like if Eddie was here, he would have just jumped into that stick shift vehicle and peeled out, right?
Yeah,
no problem. I don't remember if we know that he can drive stick, but it's like, yeah, of course Eddie can drive stick, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But like we don't have Eddie. We don't have the one guy who would be, you know, who would just make this no sweat at all and probably, you know, just solve the problem. No inconvenience at all. So, but you know, instead we get this feeling where like nothing is going their way. Like it's whereas sometimes the Dark Tower has this feeling of like Ka is kind of greasing their path for them, and I mean it never feels contrived. Although the story is kind of telling you like, hey, this is all contrived. Like it's still fun and exciting, but like this doesn't feel like that at all. This is like a sled going downhill toward a tree line, and you're like, well, the sled's gonna hit a tree. We're not sure which one yet, but it's just a matter of time when the crash will come.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there, and it's there. It does feel different. I mean, it feels like everything is stacking up to prevent them from getting there. And even the things that Jake does, like making Brian Smith have to pee, we're going to talk about that and talk about how that might have changed things in and of itself, which is interesting. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Sure.
So before we get there though, King dives into one of his classic like deep character explorations, and we return to this character of Chip McAvoy, who was back in the 70s. He was the proprietor of this general store, and he still is today in 1999. And so we meet this guy, and we meet Mrs. Tassenbaum, who is this rich middle-aged white woman that he is serving. She's buying deli meat, and she's a character that will become very, very quickly important to our quartet. I keep wanting to say quartet, and I can't even say quartet. Our group. She's very important to our group. But there's some interesting stuff that happens here, because Chip goes on this, anti-Semitic, extremely uncharitable rant about this character we've just met, this Mrs. Tassenbaum. She's a Republican. She's rich. She's Jewish. Like he justifies putting his finger on the scale of this deli meat weight to kind of scam her out of another buck. And I find this really fascinating, because King introduces us to this woman who is going to become very important to our characters very, very quickly. But he introduces us to this woman through the lens of Chip, and it's not a friendly introduction. So even if we, the reader, can recognize Chip as that cowardly idiot who kind of bumbled his way through the last interaction with Roland, we also have our only description of Mrs. Tassenbaum coming from this man. And so it kind of does influence our perception of her from the beginning. We find out she's a Kame, just like Cullum was, and in fact we'll find out that she's living at the same house John Cullum was living at, which is perfect, and I love it. But it's such an interesting choice to start out with one depiction of her, this very negative depiction of her, of this woman who will be the one that is by Jake's side when he dies, and then through the course of the interaction with her, like systematically show what her quality is.
Yeah. It's really, it really is a unusual and interesting way of doing it. Interesting way of beginning the chapter overall, I would say. Mm-hmm. I remember texting you while I was reading through about how funny some of this stuff was. Some of this stuff toward the beginning, like Chip's reaction when Roland comes in, and like just a few of these moments in here. I think a few of the moments when they're driving in the car. And because it's funny, and it was funny because you didn't respond either because you were busy or because you were like steeling yourself for what you knew was awaiting me. Right. But really, this part was like fairly lighthearted and almost silly, especially coming so hot on the heels of Eddie's death, and so just before Jake's death, it's we're getting some of these throwbacks to Roland fish out of water humor from the Drawing of the Three, I think. Yeah, a little bit. But there's a lot of throwing back going on, though.
Well, I think the interesting thing about it for me is that like all this stuff we see is before Roland even gets here. So like King, like we have Eddie, or damn it, I'm going to do that a lot. We have Jake and Roland arrive in Maine, and then we cut away from them to go inside the store and go to Chip and Mrs. Tassenbaum, and their interaction before Roland even arrives at the store. And that is, I think, where King allows some levity in here, because neither of these characters know the stakes of what's going on or have the immense grief that our other characters are feeling. And so I think he feels a little free to be his kind of very typical jokey sort of Stephen King self with these two characters. And then Jake walks in the door and the entire mood shifts, and Roland walks in the door and he recognizes Roland and the entire mood shifts.
Yeah, I think that's true. I guess I kind of thought it was funny when Roland was calling it like a automacar or whatever he was saying, but yes, definitely, like as soon as Roland is here, he's clearly has no patience for anybody's shit whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So that definitely makes it feel different. Yeah.
Because in the middle of this funny interaction where this extremely uncharitable, racist view of Mrs. Tassenbaum, Roland walks in and Chip just tries to run away and then immediately is taken down. And I love this part here. I think it's actually kind of clues you in on something that King is doing that we were talking about a little bit earlier. It says 3 or 4 people who had been browsing the aisles turned with expressions of astonishment, and one of them hit the floor in a dead faint. Chip had time to register that it was Rhoda Beamer, eldest daughter of one of the 2 women who had been killed in here on that day. Then it seemed to him that time had folded back on itself, and it was Ruth herself lying there with a can of creamed corn rolling free of one relaxing hand. He heard a bullet buzz over his head like an angry bee and skidded to a stop, his hands raised. So I love that King is introducing us to this concept of time folding back on itself here, because that's, yeah, as you've already kind of clued into, that's what's happening here. That's what's happening generally in the story almost. And he uses this small recurring beat of this, once again, Roland is in the store and guns are going off to kind of clue us in that that's what he's doing here.
Yeah, sure. It's great because, I think we feel it on a level, but King is textually, implying, hey, you're supposed to be noticing that things are echoing across time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love this part too, where Roland is trying to convince some of them to help him, and he gets a whiff of the deli meat. It says Roland could smell the meat she had been in the possession of trading for, and his stomach rumbled. He was tired, hungry, overloaded with grief, and there were too many things to think about, too many by far. His mind couldn't keep up. So we've talked about how in the moments leading to Eddie's death, King chose to keep us out of Roland's mind a lot of the time, right? We haven't been in Roland's point of view very much. He's chosen Jake's mind, Susanna's mind, or I think his most common point of view character, Eddie Dean himself. And that's done now almost by necessity, because King is just like very quickly eliminating other point of view options from us. But we are in Roland's mind in this chapter almost entirely. And it's stuff like this that I just love. I love this idea that we're back in Roland's head for the first time in a while. And I love stuff like his mind couldn't keep up. And I love this part especially because I think this is true throughout the chapter, that Roland's mind is struggling to keep up with the actual situation going on. There's several moments throughout the next chapter that I think it's going to be very obvious that his mind has not caught up with the events of what's happening.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It does feel like he's just a step too late at almost every critical moment of this part. He doesn't understand Earth. He doesn't know how to drive. He doesn't, he has to delegate everything to Jake, or to the woman who helps them. And, Jake's really the one who kind of has to take command, because he has such a broader understanding of the situation than Roland, partly due to being psychic and just kind of knowing, and just partly because he's more comfortable in this environment. Like if this were a movie and you were just watching it from the outside, Roland sort of doesn't do much and then just fails, right? Like Roland's role here is like to just like sit in the car and then watch his son die, right?
Yep, basically.
It's interesting. And I guess, part of it feels like just what the text says here. It's grief. He's overwhelmed. He's just overwhelmed. And tired, hungry, etc. But I don't know. I think just like the quartet being broken is a big part of it too. Like he can't. I guess one way of putting it is like Roland is not nearly as effective when he doesn't have a quartet around him.
Yeah, I think that's true. With the exception of maybe like one thing, which is shooting people.
Yeah.
And like we have to remember that a quartet is more than just people. Like it is a bond. It is a strength. It is a power. It is kind of Stephen King putting a term to the magical effect of a fellowship, or to quote Lord of the Rings, or a group, or the Losers Club from It, which we'll talk about one day perhaps. But there is magic in this group being together. They strengthen each other, literally through strengths and weaknesses like you were talking about, but just their connection makes them stronger than the whole. They add up to more than just each of them together. And that's gone. And he has lost something tangible in that as well as a friend and a son. Like they are just a group of people. I think he says in this chapter itself, they're just a group of people with similar goals now. That's all they are. And so you're seeing the results of that here, I think.
Yeah, it reminds me of even moments like when he had the option to keep his old quartet together, and instead he chose to split them up, and how that ended up being such a devastating choice. And they weren't even, the quartet wasn't even broken. They were just not physically together, and thus they couldn't help each other out when they needed to. And that's, it's even worse now, where it's like he's, he lost his physical fingers, and now he's sort of losing his metaphysical fingers, you could say, where,
oh, that's good. Yeah.
Because, in a sense, he traded his 3 fingers for the 3 that he drew.
Yeah.
And now that he's losing those, it's like he's down even further in the hole.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's beautiful. Well said. I think there is absolutely something to be said that perhaps a whole quartet, Roland knows immediately what Jake is thinking and what Jake is planning. Whereas we see in this one, he has no idea. He knows that Jake is hiding something, but has no way of telling what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they take Chip's car, but Jake can't drive, and Roland can't either, because we see here that his hip that has been hurting him for a while is now it's described as twisting his leg into hot fire, which is just awful. So they need someone else to drive, and they nominate poor Mrs. Tassenbaum, who gladly accepts after seeing his giant fucking gun. So they hop into the car, and you get this wonderful part. Oy scrambled for balance on Jake's lap and sprayed out a mouthful of turkey along with a word he had learned from Eddie. Irene stared at the bumbler with wide, startled eyes. Did that creature just say fuck, young man? I pull this not because I think it's like significant, like thematically to our story, but because, as we'll find out later, this is one of our last funny Oy moments, right? Like we're told later that Roland suspects that Oy is never going to speak again. So this is one of our last funny Oy says something funny moments. And I do think this one is particularly great. And not only is it great, I think it's kind of just, again, activates my grief a little bit here, because King points out that this is a line that Oy learned from Eddie Dean himself. And it's almost as if Oy recognizes Eddie's departure from the group and is trying to plug that hole a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, it's like if Eddie were here, this is what he would say in this situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and you can also believe that Oy is missing Eddie, and maybe even thinking about Eddie.
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no illusion that the Billy Bumbler understands everything that's going on and is as much a part of this family as any of them were.
Yeah, right.
He just has his communication ability is just not the same as theirs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as father of relatively small children, I basically map him onto like a 2-year-old, where
sure
like 2-year-olds are always understanding like 10 times more than you think they are. They just can't communicate very well, and so you think that they're understanding on the level that they're talking, but their talking is always way behind their understanding. And that's kind of how I've always thought of Oy, is like you could give him really elaborate instructions and he'd follow them. He just can't actually talk.
Yeah. He can just say, I ache.
Yeah. God.
All right, so we do find out that Mrs. Tassenbaum doesn't exactly know how to drive a stick shift. So the first few moments of this drive is clunky. She stalls the car multiple times. She almost gets them hit by another car. I kind of love this, Matt. If we reflect once again on what Ka is, right? If Ka is just, at its most simply, the force that creates a good story, then it makes sense that Ka would put this person in Roland and Jake's path, a person who has the exact willfulness and stomach for the deeds that the characters will need him for, who feels not just terror at their situation, but excitement at the prospect of hopping in the car with these 2 walk-ins and going on an adventure. But it's a person that lacks a key skill that will, in effect, make the race to save Stephen King a bit more exciting, a bit more tense, right? Because every time she stalls the car is another screw of tension. Will she be able to get the car up the steep hill once they get to Stephen King's house? She doesn't know. We don't know. And that's more tension. That's more Ka. That's just more of turning that screw of tension. And so, of course, Tassenbaum is the Ka-Mei, because she serves both purposes perfectly.
Uh-huh. But in this particular case, she's no John Cullum, right? Like
no.
Like you feel like John Cullum he just had everything that they needed, right? He had the boat,
Sure.
he had the nearby house, he knew all the information. Bam, bam, boom. It was done. It was easy. They barely even had to break a sweat. She is serving Ka. She is serving the story. In this case, though, Ka doesn't want them to succeed necessarily, or rather, Ka's going to demand a sacrifice.
It's like how things are always more tense if you let the bomb count down to 1 before you defuse it, right?
True.
Like in a version where someone who knows how to drive a stick shift was put in their way, on their path, then they maybe just get to Stephen King sooner.
Right.
And it's less tense.
Right.
So instead, Ka gives them someone that has the exact stomach for what they're doing, but lacks that skill to make it more tense, to allow those extra seconds to tick off. So we get this really tense last second diving save that Jake does. And so, yeah, I mean, that is what a good story almost demands, right? I mean, that's the joke at the end of Galaxy Quest is like, why didn't it stop till it got down to 1? Because that is always what happened on the show.
Right.
It's like the same thing. So Ka's going to put someone in their way that allows them to get the job done, but at the most tense moment possible.
Yeah. I think that follows. It does seem like Tassenbaum is more excited than she is terrified.
Oh, sure.
Like she's a very unusual kind of person who sees men with guns come into a building and is like, I want to help you.
Yeah.
She sized it up and decided that for whatever reason, this is her thing. Also, I really enjoyed the part where King, writes her terrifying, jerky, transmission destroying process of trying to figure out how to drive the car, because that's exactly what it's like to learn to drive stick. So
I'm pretty impressed that she picked it up as quickly as she did, all things considered.
Yeah. Oh, and I mean, anybody can drive stick if they don't care about their clutch or their transmission. So.
Poor Chip. Your car is never going to be the same, old Chip.
Yep.
All right. So then our story shifts over and we meet Brian Smith, the man who will eventually hit King and Jake with his van. So obviously King has embellished many of the real parts of his story in both this book and all the books, but it's kind of shocking how close to the truth of what happened in real life happens here. This is the guy who hit Stephen King in real life. His name was Brian Smith. He did absolutely have a horrible driving record. But I love how King characterizes him, because here's how King introduces us to this character. He pulls out of the campground and onto Route 6 with not so much as a glance in either direction, then says, whoops, forgot again. No traffic, though. Later on, especially after the 4th of July and until Labor Day, there'd be plenty of traffic to contend with, even out here in the boonies, and he'll probably stay closer to home. He knows he isn't much of a driver. One more speeding ticket or a fender bender, and he'll probably lose his license for 6 months. Again. And this is how King is characterizing the man who almost killed him. Like, he's got the real name. He constructs a scenario almost identically as the way it actually happened in real life. And who does he make this guy out to be? He's an idiot, like goofball, a dummy.
He's King a comic relief character.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. And King is obviously working out some demons with this section, right? Like he almost died, and he brings this near-death experience into his novel and writes about it and explores it and pokes at it from different directions. There's a lot of him trying to understand and process his own mortality here in these chapters. But when it comes to Brian Smith, he's just a fucking idiot.
Yep.
And you really get the sense that that's what King just genuinely believes about this man that almost ended his life.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with what you just said about this being like this is sort of therapeutic for King, right? Like, yeah. I feel like part of his recovery from this horrible event was like processing it through this book, mm-hmm. and coming to terms with it. I mean, I really think that's a big part of what the Dark Tower became after the accident. And I think when we talk about stuff like Roland's dry twist in a minute, we'll have more to say about the idea that the Dark Tower really shifted into being King's meditation and almost sort of self-therapy for dealing with all of the emotions and physical difficulties that came along with the accident.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, I guess he could have been meaner to Brian Smith, but he certainly doesn't go easy on him either. It just makes you think like, this guy sucks. He's an idiot. He's a buffoon, and like I mean, sort of. I mean, yet again, he's sort of the banality of evil type of monster, where he's like, I'm going to get high and drive around, not look where I'm going, and predictably almost kill someone.
Well, isn't that so? I mean, we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but isn't that so interesting though? Because like, he's constructed this situation in which his life or death is what the entire universe hinges on, which is hilarious. But he does it in this really interesting way where he doesn't have like, there's a way you could write this in which like the Crimson King appears in front of Brian Smith and distracts him or something, or some minion of evil like appears or inhabits or possesses Brian Smith in the moments before he runs over Stephen King. But that's not the way it happens. It happens the way it actually happened in real life, which is just like incompetence and happenstance. And that like, and I think to get to a point where you, Stephen King, are looking at the situation in which you almost died and kind of wondering like, why did this happen to me? Why me? Why this moment? Why now? I think part of the therapy is getting to a point where you just come to recognize that it's just dumb luck. It's just dumb, stupid chance. And that's all it is. Like, this is just an idiot who probably shouldn't have been driving, who should have done 20 different things than he did. And things would have happened differently. And I don't know. I find that fascinating because he could have done like a lot. I think that's kind of how evil works in the story sometimes, is just through bad luck, bad ka, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of ka, I mean, we all kind of want to believe that there are like satisfying reasons for things in stories, definitely, but in real life too. Like we're sort of addicted to it. Like it's why we watch the news, is we want to know what's the story that explains the thing that's happening. And then we get somebody comes up with a nice, simple narrative that explains the thing, and we say, okay, I get it. All right, I get it now. I don't have to worry about this anymore because I understand it, because I know the story. And yeah, I mean, the Crimson King possessing him, or Mordred being in the back of the car and jumping on him and causing him to swerve. These are all things where it's like, oh yes, of course that makes sense. That makes sense narratively. But no, it's just random. It's just the kind of thing where it's reality. Reality is full of random, horrible disasters. And when one of them happens to you, or happens kind of adjacent to you, to someone you care about, or something along those lines, it's actually very hard to accept. Like, no, there's no reason. There's no reason. Mm-hmm. There's no ka here. It's actually just, I mean, ka does not drive Brian Smith, because he's a real person and this really happened. Yeah. This is just randomness, right? And that's so hard for our brains to accept.
Oh yeah. And the way King processes this, I think, is just part of what really makes me fall in love with the story. I think you were absolutely right that that the accident is the hinge on which these final three novels turn. And while my favorite books in the series, The Drawing of the Three and Wizard and Glass, are from before his accident, kind of the reason why I really fell in love with the series as a whole was because of it becomes this intensely personal reflection on Stephen King dealing with his own mortality and trying to understand. And I love how he both inserts the randomness of it, but also tries to assign meaning to it throughout his story. Like, that's kind of what he's doing here, right? He's acknowledging that this is random happenstance, but at the same time, he's also trying to ascribe meaning to it. He's trying to say, okay, well, this is some force was trying to stop me. Or if we get right down to it, I was being punished for my failure to do something. Like, my role in this world is to tell these stories, to sing these songs. And I was failing to live up to my role, and the universe punished me for it. That's fascinating.
Yeah. I'm still not 100% sure whether actual real life Stephen King really believes that he's being cosmically punished for not finishing his books, but it was fascinating to consider. I mean, at least it was something that was on his mind because he put it in this book.
Yeah, I don't want to like jump to conclusions like that and say definitively that is what he believes. I don't think so either, but you can't write about it if you're not thinking about it. And that's like a lot of this is him kind of working through these emotions, I think, and he's working through them on the page for all of us to read.
Yeah, I think so.
So we jumped way ahead here. We're going to have to circle around to all this stuff. But the most interesting thing about Brian Smith we learn here is this quote right here where he says, "You ne mind that hamburger. That's my supper." He says supper as John Cullum would, but the face looking back at the bright-eyed dogs from the rearview mirror is the face of Shimi Ruiz. Almost exactly. Shimi could be Brian Smith's litter twin. So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, super fascinating. I mean, I feel it's safe to say that we're straying into fictionalization here because Shimi was invented long before the accident happened.
Sure. Yeah.
So he's just kind of retconned this, if you will. You know, I've avoided reading too much about the events surrounding the accident because I avoid reading too much about anything that could be tangential to the Dark Tower. But sure. I do clearly remember at some point reading like King's account of the accident a long time ago, and like my recollection is like the guy gets out, according to King, the guy gets out of his car and starts talking to King, who's just like lying there horribly injured in shock, and the guy's just like affably talking to him, and one of King's first thoughts was, my God, I've been killed by a character from one of my novels. And I thought at the time that what he meant was like the guy was weird, the guy was off, like the guy was being weirdly cheerful in a situation where it was the worst moment of Stephen King's life. But it's fascinating that King then made him a character in one of his novels and said, actually, he looks just like Shimi, in fact. So yeah,
Shimi, one of Roland's oldest friends, one of Roland's companions from long ago that he has just been reunited with and has been key to helping them along on their quest. It's such an interesting choice. It's almost as if to say, just like Shimi has been tangential to Roland and has like they've intersected at certain points and then kind of gone off. That's what Brian Smith was to Stephen King. It's like these two characters, there's two humans just going along their course and inevitably going to meet up. Just like Roland and Shimi in the Devar Toy. It's just really fascinating to me. And also I think he's also kind of making a comment on Brian Smith's intelligence level, I think, as well. Because Shimi, you know, is developmentally disabled in some way. We don't actually understand how, but there's something there, right? So I think he's also like making a comment on Brian Smith's intelligence. But
I think so. I mean, also I noticed like we've got dogs in the car, and then we use the term litter twin, which immediately makes you think that he's comparing him to a dog.
Oh yeah. It's great. I love it.
Yeah.
So Roland, Jake, Irene, and Oy arrive at Stephen King's house, which is 19 Turtleback Lane. Kara laughs, of course, the place where Roland and Eddie left from. Stephen, we already knew that he bought this place. Roland realized that last week, but yeah, he bought this place and he lives here now, which is just perfect. But we learn that Stephen King is already out on his walk. They're running out of time.
Yeah, the fact that they miss him here, I think, really amplifies this sense that like things are just not going right. They're not in this well-worn track of Ka. Fate is not helping their quest. Nothing is going right.
Yeah, no, totally. And then we get this part. Roland was looking at Jake with a frank and horrified source of fascination, but in his current state, the boy either did not understand the look or missed it entirely. Why are you lying, Jake? The gunslinger thought. And then, on the heels of that, he's not. What if it already happened? Jake demanded. And yes, he was worried about King, but Roland didn't think that was all he was worried about. What if he's dead and his family's not here because the police called them and... It hasn't happened, Roland said. But that was all of which he was sure. What do you know, Jake? And why won't you tell me? There was no time to wonder about it now. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how Roland's kind of slow plotting brain that he's always been described as having is just not keeping up with his body, not keeping up with the events of what's happening. I think if he had half a second to think, Roland would probably cue in on exactly what Jake knows and why he won't tell it. This is also, by the way, why Stephen King is very consciously keeping us out of Jake's head, out of Jake's point of view for almost the entirety of this chapter. Jake knows what's coming. Jake knows what he's going to have to do. And Roland hasn't caught up on it yet. So we're staying out of Jake, so we won't quite have caught up on it yet.
It's definitely worth mentioning that, like, it was like an hour ago or less that Eddie told Jake, you got to protect your den. That's your job. Mm-hmm. And so his mind is racing ahead there. Also, like Roland, if Roland were firing on all cylinders, you imagine that he would just be like, what is it, Jake? Tell me what's wrong. Like the fact that it doesn't even really occur to him to sort of try to draw that information out of Jake, I think is interesting.
Yeah, you're right. He doesn't communicate to him. He doesn't ask the question out loud. He's speaking in his mind. Why are you lying, Jake? What do you know, and why won't you tell me? He's not communicating because they're not quartet anymore. They're just two buddies on the quest together. That line of communication has been severed.
Yeah. It's like because they're not quartet, it doesn't even occur to him that he could communicate. And this is really, I mean, I think this is throughout the whole series, this has been like Roland's, I don't know if Achilles heel or bad habit or whatever, where like when things go wrong, it's very often because Roland either withheld information or like distanced himself from his teammates. Yeah. And this is yet another example of that, where he's not withholding information, but there is that sense of distance there. I think that's part of what costs them.
I think this goes back to the kind of doubling back on itself thing we were talking about earlier too, where Roland and Jake walked into the mountain and Roland figured out exactly what was going to happen, and he didn't tell Jake about it. And Jake slowly clued into it and knew it was going to happen too. But neither of them had any power to stop it, or Roland wasn't interested in stopping it, and Jake couldn't, or was too afraid, or what have you. And it's very much kind of the same thing here, a little bit reversed though, because as we'll see, the sacrifice here is almost exactly the opposite of the way it happened last time.
That's a really good point. Yeah. That's a fantastic comparison, because I think you could even argue, I want to reread that now and see, like, does Roland literally have a psychic premonition about what's going to happen in the mountain? Because I feel like it's almost that level of certainty about what's going to happen.
I don't think he has a psychic premonition. I think he, like, if you recall, he steps into the mountain knowing that he will be the only one coming out the other side. Yeah. Like that's when he does the very conscious uncoupling from Jake. Right. When he steps into that mountain, he knows that this is what's going to happen, and he just keeps going anyway. Yeah. And Jake, for his part, kind of slowly clues into it as he goes along, partially because of his touch, partially because of like just he's seeing the writing on the wall. Yeah. And it's very much the same, but reversed here. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So the guy cutting King's Long tells the group where they can find him, and they head off to catch up. Jake attempts to reach out and touch Stephen King, but he finds not King himself, but Brian Smith, who he tries to stall by making him have to piss real bad. It's really interesting to think about this for a minute, because in a little bit, we'll learn that the only spot on the road King is walking that has like a blind hill is the exact spot where King and Brian Smith meet. And so you start wondering, okay, had he not stopped to pee, would it have been that spot that he would have hit King? Would he have not gotten to King a little sooner, and King maybe would have seen him because it was not a blind hill, so he would have seen him in time to step out of the way or jump out of the way or get out of the way or something? Like, these are useless questions to ask, I think, because the answer is, I don't know. But I think they do spring to mind. And to me, they're kind of the same questions I think a person is asking themselves when they're wondering, why me? Why did this happen to me? Did Brian Smith actually stop to pee in the middle of his journey down the road that day? And if so, like, how different would things be if he hadn't done that? And these are the questions I think you ask yourself when you're trying to, like, anytime you're in an accident or anytime something terrible happens. I think one of the things I've always thought of is, like, if I just left 5 seconds earlier or 5 seconds later or some, you know, like it's just the smallest amount of time, the littlest change, and this doesn't happen. And these things go through your head, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these were the thoughts going through my head as I was reading this week, as well. Like, you know, what if this is what caused the accident? Like, are we going to play with kind of a butterfly effect, predestination paradox thing? You know, in a sense, like almost by definition, anything that doesn't successfully stop Brian Smith, almost by definition, contributes to the accident. Because, like you said, I mean, I think you can actually say confidently that if he hadn't taken like a, you know, like a 2-minute pit stop, then all the variables are different. Right? He doesn't swerve at the same time. King is not, you know, King is paying more attention. So like it's just destined, right? It's destined. Ka has demand. I think, you know, from the, I don't even know what level of meta we're talking about here, but from whatever level of meta is relevant, Ka has decided that this is going to happen, and it's decided that there's going to be a sacrifice because, Ka has decided, you know, Stephen King is either going to die or he's going to be saved in a way that requires a sacrifice, because the story wouldn't be very satisfying if he just got saved scot-free, you know. Like that's my interpretation of why Ka wants to do that.
Sure. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. But in this moment, Roland finally remembers the thing that he told Jake that night when they were out talking about what's going to happen next, that Stephen King dying is Ka. And to change Ka, there must be a sacrifice. And here's this beautiful writing here. During the long years he had spent on the trail of the man in black, the gunslinger would have sworn nothing in the universe could have caused him to renounce the tower. Had he not literally killed his own mother in pursuit of it back at the start of his terrible career? But in those years he had been friendless, childless, and he didn't like to admit it, but it was true, heartless. He had been bewitched by that cold romance, the loveless mistake for love. Now he had a son, and he had been given a second chance, and he had changed. Knowing that one of them must die in order to save the writer, that their fellowship must be reduced again, and so soon, would not make him cry off. But he would make sure that Roland of Gilead and not Jake of New York provided the sacrifice this time. It's this incredibly important moment, right? Like this is a seminal moment for Roland. Like we've been wondering about this since the very first book. When it comes time to it, will Roland again choose to sacrifice Jake to the tower? And the answer here is no, he won't. He won't make that choice. Unfortunately, that's not the way things work, buddy.
Yeah.
and I think going back to his brain not keeping up, I think if it was, he would have maybe realized it. He would have realized that's not how Ka works sometimes, that you don't get to say who has to be the one to make the sacrifice.
Right. Yeah. It's the sort of thing where as soon as it's happened, he's like, oh, yeah, I should have seen that coming. Right. But really beautiful writing in that paragraph you just read.
Oh, yeah.
There's, I think, a flicker of King's own thought process here as well, because we know, I think, that King brought Jake back to life because King himself grew up. He had kids. His values changed. He had a second chance. He was young and he was heartless, if you will, when he wrote The Gunslinger. But then he grew up. He changed. He decided to bring Jake back. But you know, we have to have the sad ending, I guess. We have to make everybody sad now. So.
Don't you just love that? Like friendless, childless, and heartless. He didn't like to admit, but it was true, heartless. He had been bewitched by that cold romance, the loveless mistake for love. That's a fascinating sentence, right? What is he talking about there?
I mean, honestly, I find that to be incredibly powerful because I think a lot of people can relate to being, I don't know, early 20s and having like some ambition that seems incredibly important to them. And I'm not, this is going to come out wrong. I think maybe, cause like, I don't want to criticize people who have powerful passions in their life. I think, you know, it's great. It's all good. But then you get older and you have like deeper friendships and family and potentially children, and then you realize like, oh, this is completely different. I had no idea that this was here, that this aspect of my mind or you know, that this depth of love could exist. So like, I don't know, that's just I think that, you know, everyone has their tower, you know, that's kind of the metaphor of the tower. I think that's why it's so universal. That's why the story is so universal and so appealing, is that everyone has their tower. It's not even necessarily, you know, drugs or alcohol or anything along those lines. It could just be a thing that has fixated you, and you know, you think you're in love with it, but it's actually cold and it's not going to fulfill you. I don't know. I'm kind of riffing here, but I honestly, these are all the feelings that kind of flooded through me when I read that line. I think this is one of the most amazing lines in the book.
Yeah, it's really beautiful and wonderful. I love this whole paragraph. Like the knowing that one of them must die in order to save the writer would not make him cry off, but he would make sure that Roland of Gilead, not Jake of New York, provided the sacrifice this time. Like, he's like, knowing that one of us has to die, we're not done. We have to do this. I recognize the importance of this. I recognize I have to do this, but it's me this time. It's me this time. And of course we know that it isn't. It just isn't.
Yeah. Right. I mean, yes, just to hit that beat one more time. We probably asked the question literally 50 times in the course of this show. You know, would Roland do this? And sometimes I think the answer that we've come to has been no, sometimes maybe, but here it's a yeah. It's a, if he, you know, he intends to do it, he intends to be the one to sacrifice himself. And so he has changed. He really has changed, and that makes it all the more tragic, right? Makes it all the more tragic that it didn't actually end up mattering that he had changed.
This is why I think you just can't hate Roland, right? Like, Roland does some terrible things in these books at times, and some frustrating things. And I mean, the defining characteristic of early Roland is that he let Jake fall. But then you have moments like this where he says no. He says, no, I won't do that again. Things are going to be different this time. No, I've learned, I've changed. And the story says, yeah, well, fuck you. It makes him feel powerless to this, right? It makes him feel like it doesn't matter what he chooses one way or another. The things that he loves will be stripped from him, whether he chooses for that to happen or whether he chooses for it to not happen. They will be taken from him.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reminded that he thinks of himself as the slave of Ka.
Yeah,
and this is yet another example of like, you know, he thinks this is his decision to make, but yet again, he's just a slave of Ka.
Mm-hmm. All right, then we get this part as well, where it says, drive, Irene. Do it as if Lord High Splitfoot were on your trail with a rape on his mind. Do ya, I beg. Out Warrington's road. If we don't see him there, out the 7 road, will you? You're fucking right, said Mrs. Tassenbaum as she shoved the gear ship into first with real authority. I love this because, like, that sentence he just said to her was almost entirely nonsense. Like, she doesn't get the context or any of that, but she's just like, hell fucking yeah, buddy, let's do it. She's in.
Right. I picked up the important cues there. Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, she's such a fun character. I mean, despite the fact that this is a very tense and soon to be a horrible situation, she is sort of a bright spot in all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, Matt, here we go. We cut over to Stephen King for the first time. He's out on his walk and he's thinking to himself, you can do some work. Maybe start on that next Dark Tower story. You know it's been on your mind. Aye, so it has. But he already has a story to work on, and he likes it fine. Going back to the tale of the tower means swimming in deep water, maybe drowning there. Yet he suddenly realizes, standing here at the crossroads, that if he goes back early, he will begin. He won't be able to help himself. He'll have to listen to what he sometimes thinks of as Vez Kagan, the song of the turtle, and sometimes as Susanna's song. He'll junk the current story, turn his back on the safety of the land, and swim out into the dark water once again. He's done it 4 times before, but this time he'll have to swim all the way to the other side. Swim or drown. No, he says, and then he decides to go on the longer walk, the one that will meet his fate on. So here we have King once again rejecting the song, rejecting the writing, and we all pay the price for it. And it's just like, the responsibility, like, once again, we've talked so much about how putting yourself in your story, how much there's like this perceived arrogance there, that cockiness, like he literally makes himself responsible for the existence of the entire universe. But he does it in such a way like this, where he says, the reason why I'm even in danger is because I'm a fucking lazy piece of shit.
Yeah. Yeah, he's so hard on himself here, both through his characterization of the Stephen King character and through the way Roland is going to treat him when they actually meet in a minute. It's painful, right? It's God, it's one of the more painful parts of this chapter to me is how much pain is conveyed by King's attitude toward himself, and just the like part of it is a feeling like it didn't have to happen this way. Maybe I could have avoided this. Maybe, you know, like he knows. I don't know. I don't know Stephen King, but like if I met him, one of the things I might ask him is like, do you actually feel really bad about yourself for not writing the Dark Tower books faster? Like, because I think there's a good chance that he does. Because like he mentioned the idea in a previous book that, like, you know, he had a, you know, potentially elderly, sick and dying person waiting for another book, and he's fully aware that he basically failed them.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that's gotta suck, right? That's I think any successful writer or creator probably has to live with that kind of regret when they know they should finish and they just don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, like, we talked about this when this concept was first introduced, this idea that King is making literal and making magical a kind of feeling that I think all writers have, which is like this feeling of this desire to return to a certain story, or this desire or this fear from returning to a certain story. I mean, he's kind of made it like metaphysical and real and magic in this, but this idea, this central idea that when you write the Dark Tower series, you're leaving the safety of land, right? I think this is beautiful imagery. It's like, when I write these books, I know their importance. Their importance to me personally, their importance to my readers. This is a thing that I've kind of arrogantly declared in my youth as my Lord of the Rings, my magnum opus, my defining text of my career. I declared this at the very beginning, and now I have to live up to that declaration. And that's scary. It's so much easier to go write a collection of short stories. It's so much easier to go write about this cool, new, fresh, shiny idea I thought of on my last walk. It's so much easier to do those things, which if I fuck that up, it's just another novel. I've written a bunch of them. But if I fuck up the Dark Tower, that's my thing.
Yeah. That's
my thing. And it is so easy to see why a person would keep turning away from that and keep turning away from. I don't know if he actually had these moments throughout his career where he was like, he consciously made the decision, no, I'm not going to work on that. It's too scary. The risk is too high. But I feel like he's acknowledging on some level, maybe, that subconsciously that was what's going on through me, that I didn't even realize it. Maybe it's why I always conveniently had another book to write about and never went back to this one. Why I found it very easy to push those letters that were piling up from people demanding the next entry. Like, it's so human and understandable.
Yeah.
And he's punishing himself for it.
He's punishing himself, and he's struggling. And I want to connect this to a beat we just discussed. He's struggling with the fact that he's been given a second chance, because he did almost die, but he didn't die. And he has a second chance to finish. And I think, I mean, again, I'm psychoanalyzing the author, which is not something I love to do, but he is sort of inviting it here.
Sure.
He's struggling with the idea that he's being given a second chance, and now he really he's obligated to finish this. Like he almost died without finishing this. Come on, man. And second chances, Eddie just, one of the last things he said to Roland was, "Thank you for my second chance." And Roland himself just said of himself, Roland had been given a second chance. He had a son now. Everything was different. He had changed. All these characters getting second chances. This is all about second chances. Everything in the latter half of the Dark Tower is about second chances, because King got his second chance. I really think that's one of the key ingredients here.
I'm so glad you picked up on that. I think you're absolutely right. It's Beautiful.
Cool. Good.
All right, let's move on.
All right.
He begins to walk towards the sound of the oncoming Dodge Caravan, which is also the sound of his oncoming death. The Ka of the rational world wants him dead. That of the Prim wants him alive and singing his song. So it is that on the sunny afternoon in western Maine, the irresistible force rushes towards the immovable object. And for the first time since the Prim receded, all worlds and all existence turns toward the dark tower which stands at the far end of Can Ka no Re, which is to say the red fields of none. Even the Crimson King ceases his angry screaming, for it is the dark tower that will decide. Resolution demands sacrifice, King says, and although no one hears but the birds, and he has no idea what this means, he is not disturbed. He's always muttering to himself. It's as though there is a cave of voices in his head, one full of brilliant, but not necessarily intelligent, mimics. He walks, swinging his arms beside his blue-jeaned thighs, unaware that his heart isn't finishing its last few beats, that his mind isn't thinking its last few thoughts, that his voices aren't making their last Delphic pronouncements. So that's a whole lot to talk about there, Matt.
Yeah. I really just love this. I was very arrested by this mental image of him being a writer, having a head full of kind of babbling mimics.
Yeah.
Which he in his kind of standard self-deprecating fashion is like, I'm not saying that they're smart, but they are really good. That they are consistent, right? Kind of like the cave of voices that we've already established, which, the story sort of leaves it open whether these are actually ghosts or whether this is just a sort of trick. I think we're meant to think it's just a trick from the evil magic or whatever. But
sure, yeah.
But yeah, that's fun for sure. And then of course him using the parentheticals here is
it's
very
wonderful.
Fun.
Yeah, it's so fun. It's wonderful because like it's declarative, right? And then there's like this sneaking thought is like, no, there's still a chance. And I love that this image of like existence as a whole stops. Even the Crimson King ceases his angry screaming. And everyone in existence is now looking towards the tower, looking towards this one moment that will decide the fate of everything. For it is the dark tower that will decide, which once again kind of removes agency from our characters, right? It is not Roland that will decide what's going to happen here. It is the dark tower is going to decide this. And we see that kind of is because it takes Roland's chance away from him and gives it to Jake.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I fully understand I think I know what Ka wants pretty well now. We said that a few times and been slightly wrong before, but I think I have a pretty good feeling what Ka wants. Not sure if I understand what the Dark Tower wants, other than to exist.
Resolution demands sacrifice, man.
Yeah,
that's like he's saying this and it sounds good, but it is kind of a rule of storytelling he's uttering here, right?
Yeah.
Like why to save Stephen King must Jake die? Because resolution demands a sacrifice. To resolve something, you must give up something else. That is one of the basic tenements of conflict, right? That in a conflict, it's two sides coming together. One of them must win. It doesn't have to be the good guy. It can be the bad guy, but that's conflict. In storytelling, conflict is two opposing sides coming together. One must win, one must lose. And something must be sacrificed.
Yeah.
And here it is.
And we have the idea that Ka is sort of in conflict here. We have the Ka of the rational world and the Ka of the Prim have conflicting aims here. So Ka can't resolve this on its own. The Dark Tower is basically the tiebreaker that comes in when the story doesn't know which way to go, you could say.
Yeah.
Like we break this down from the metaphor level into the man writing a story and thinking of fun metaphors for the things that he's doing while writing the story. He's conflicted about which way to take the story. What is the principle that breaks a blockage in the writing process? It's kill your darlings, I think is what it is. It's brutal pragmatism. It's the Dark Tower. It's you got to kill the boy. This
It's so great because there's another story. There's a story about King writing a book, and I can't spoil this for you because we're going to read the book one day. But he got stuck while writing the book, and he didn't know what to do next, and he was stuck on the book for months and months and months. And then he basically said, "Oh, I gotta blow all this shit up," and it's a literal bomb that blows up his writer's block. So I think that's something that he would agree with a lot. What you're saying just now.
I mean, it's funny because I feel like I agree as somebody who writes stories. Like when you get stuck, there's very often nothing to do other than be like, well, something terrible and disruptive has to happen. Otherwise, this is just a dead end. Anyway. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. All right, so back with Brian Smith, his dog Bullet gets into his meat cooler and starts eating at that hamburgers. This, by the way, just to give more real world information, is what the real Brian Smith said really happened. His dog got into his cooler because there was meat in there. His dog named Bullet. King didn't even change the name of the dog. And while he was trying to get his dog's head out of the cooler, he swerved his car, and Stephen King just happened to be right there. And through this book, Stephen King lets us know what he thinks about that excuse, because he writes, "At this point, any reasonable driver would have pulled over to the side of the road, stopped his vehicle, and taken care of his wayward animal. Brian Smith, however, has never gotten high marks for reason when behind the wheel, and has the driving record to prove it. Instead of pulling over, he twists around to the right, steering with his left hand and shoving ineffectually at the top of the Rottweiler's flat head with his right." It's perfect.
I love even like little words like shoving ineffectually. Like
yeah.
You just it's. I mean, it's a comedy beat, really. Like
it is.
Like in the midst of all this tension, it's like this idiot. God. Like, yeah.
But this circles back to what we were talking about earlier. That this is King attempting to make reason out of nonsense. Why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? Well, because the evil forces of the world wanted me dead, right? Because I did something wrong. But how did those forces act? Did the Crimson King appear? No. Did the evil loosen the cooler? Did like an evil spirit get into the dog to make him go for the cooler? No. It's just a random, meaningless moment. A dog smells some meat and decides to go for it. A man chose to keep driving instead of pulling over. And Stephen King picked the long walk home today instead of the short one. Mm-hmm. That's why it happened.
Yeah. Yeah, again, life is so fragile and kind of drives me crazy, to be honest. That, every time the universe confronts me with random senseless death, it just seems unbelievable. Like no, that can't be right. We have laws. Surely there's some kind of clerical mistake. And, let me call customer service. But I think these are the feelings that the book is confronting us with here, where we just have such a hard time accepting random, stupid, bad luck. And there's always this feeling, like we said earlier, the feeling like it could have gone otherwise. Or I mean, I think also, though, wrapped up in all this is the feeling that it could have been worse, because King could have died. So in a sense, he should be thankful that it wasn't worse, right? Like that's the fascinating thing about it, is that you can simultaneously, from King's point of view, resent the fact that this guy hit you with his car, and be simultaneously thankful that you're not dead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the wonderful part about it is while Stephen King is sitting here via the story asking why this happened to me, he's also simultaneously trying to understand why he survived, right? He's like, it's both, why did this terrible thing happen to me? And also, how the fuck did I survive that, right? And I think these are feelings that you have whenever you experience something like this, that like neither side of that makes sense. Why did he, in any other time he would have killed me, like, right? If I think, I forget like what actually happens to Stephen King. He has like his leg is shattered. I think he's got broken ribs. I think one of his lungs is punctured. Like this is like, he was hurt. He was very close to death. And it's just happenstance that things didn't break in just the right way that led him to die immediately. And so he tries to subscribe meaning to that too. Well, the reason I didn't die is because some kid jumped in the way and pulled me out of the way at the last minute. Not enough to prevent my injuries, but enough to prevent a fatal injury. And but you're actually right that it's frustrating that life doesn't work this way. I think like one truth about humans is we love stories so much and we love storytelling so much, and storytelling is such an ingrained part of our lives that we, like you said, we try to attach narrative to everything that happens to us. And it's just not the way the world works. And that frustrates the shit out of us. Yeah. And we try anyway. We keep trying. Every day we're trying to do that. Like, we're the main character in our story and we're trying to understand the events of our life through that narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a very, very deep idea I think that's why, you and I we're having a fun time talking about stories, but like, a huge amount of what we talk about is life too. And that's because stories are just really the main and only way we have of grappling with life.
Yep.
So like, it's not a coincidence. And like, that's, I think on some level why we do this. Like, that's why it's important to us that we do this. It's not, it's like, like it's fun, but it's more than fun. I think it's like, it feels important to me.
Yeah, the stories are my way of processing the things I both understand and don't understand about life. That's why I love them, and that's why I love talking about them. So yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that we continuously relate this. We're talking about why Stephen King wrote this way. We're psychoanalyzing him in some ways, in which, again, I agree with you that I don't like to do that very much, but also I agree with you that whenever you place yourself in your novel, you are basically telling people to do that. But we also talk about our own lives and instances in which something like this similar happened to us, or what this means to us on a personal level. And it's because that's what stories are to me. And I think you share that belief. So
yeah, I agree completely.
Okay, well, here we go. So the chapter ends with the door popped open and the one named Roland half rolled, half jumped out of the truck. After that, things happened very, very fast. And I'm just trying to imagine a world in which, like, we stopped recording at this point and you had to wait another week to talk about the next chapter, because I think there is a feeling of like, okay, this is it. Roland's going to die. He's going to save Stephen King. And then it's Jake to the finish line. But
yeah, possible.
Of course, that's not the way it happens.
Right.
And we begin chapter 2, Ves Kagan. The first thing that happens here is that Roland's bad hip betrays him, as we're told. Or should we say Ka betrays him. Roland falls to his knees, and it's Jake that leaps over him. Jake, who can move so fast that he can be a blur sometimes. And we get this. Oi was barking crazily from the cab of the truck. Ache, 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 ache. Jake, no, Roland shouted. He saw it all with a terrible clarity. The boy seized the rider around the waist as the blue vehicle, neither a truck nor a car, but seemingly a cross between the two, bore down upon him in the roar of dissonant music. Jake turned King to the left, shielding him with his body. And so it was Jake the vehicle struck. So here we go, Matt. Jake of New York struck by a vehicle in his first death and struck by a vehicle in his last death. Let's maybe talk for a minute here about how Stephen King saves his own life by taking Jake's. And we've kind of been circling around this the whole episode, but I want to kind of point at it specifically here.
Yeah, sure. I think, again, I think we already mentioned this before, but the idea that there's been a lot of imagery surrounding Jake being hit by a car, like when they popped out in the street in New York previously.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if like, this is like in a Final Destination-y kind of way. This was meant to be Jake's death, and this is the death that's been chasing him since he got a second chance after the first one, right? Yeah. And so it's been after him, and so it is very poetically fitting that this is the thing that is his final death.
Yeah. I mean, and I like that. To offer a completely contradictory interpretation, you could say that it's just this is the means by which Ka dictates that he cross the veil whenever he's going to do that. I don't know. I think it works really well as like a motif
sure.
in the story.
Yeah, I get that. So, despite Jake's efforts, the van still rolls over Stephen King, giving him the injuries he receives in real life, but not killing him. And as soon as King gets his injuries, Roland's go away. it was never the dry twist. It was never arthritis. It was just this. But the question remains, Matt, and this is the question I'm going to ask you right now. Why did Roland have these injuries before King got them in the first place? Why?
I don't know. I don't have a clean answer for that. I mean, we have this notion that shoved in our face by the text that, sacrifice is required for resolution. Mm-hmm. And here King cheats death, but a sacrifice is still required. The sacrifice to not die is that he has to take on the pain of the character that he created who was bearing that pain. Now, I don't really think that makes sense, what I just said. But I don't know what else to say. Like there's also possibly more relevant Doylistic levels where, if King hadn't been struck by a van, then the Dark Tower saga would have looked very different. As we said earlier, the themes in the plot that dominate every book after Wizard and Glass would have been totally different without this accident. We wouldn't have this man struggle with the physical pain and the mental stress of a close brush with death and then recovery from severe physical injury. We would have had something else. Who knows what else? It'd be fascinating to ask King, what did he have in mind for where the Dark Tower was going to go before the accident? That would be a fascinating question to ask.
I don't even know if he'd answer that one, to be honest with you.
Right. And I wouldn't mind if he didn't. But in a very real sense, being struck by the van is what gave Roland the dry twist, right? It's clearly the reason why Roland has this hip pain is because the author has this hip pain.
Yeah.
Because Roland is a kind of metaphysical reflection of King. He even looks like him. We know this.
I mean, it's almost as if by putting off writing the story, King was pushing the pain that belonged to him onto someone else, mm-hmm. and punishing someone else for that, right? Because that's kind of what he is doing. All of this is punishing Roland. The thing about Jake's death is that it is almost specifically just a knife twist for Roland. I mean, yes, Jake died, and that's very sad, but Jake's died twice already. Yeah. So Jake's number has been up a few times. This is a specific moment of fuck you, Roland. And so he had the King had got afraid, didn't want to write, pushed the pain of that consequence onto Roland for a long time until finally at the end he takes it back at that final moment. Uh-huh. And Roland is freed from it when King resolves to finish the story again, but something else must be taken from him.
Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. I think it's also time to mention, the horrifying irony that King wrote Jake's original death scene long before the accident. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's chilling actually to consider that, Jake being hit by a car was a plot point before Stephen King was hit by a car. That's creepy and makes the first death seem prophetic, actually. Although obviously King is able to write the story in a way that makes it seem that way, clearly. I mean, that I don't know if I'm communicating clearly, but it feels creepy and just a tad supernatural to me that Jake is killed by a car, gets sent to Midworld, and then ends up having to get hit by a car again to save Stephen King, who was actually hit by a car in actual real life. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. I mean, it's one of those things where you feel sometimes life feels like a story because it's absurd. It's absurd that it happened this way.
Exactly.
And I think part of why King is writing the book this way is because he's looking at that absurdity and saying you couldn't script it like this. Right. Look, here, I'll do it. And it's wild. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah.
All right. So we get this very important part. He looked at Stephen King's unnaturally twisted body beneath the left front wheel of the blue vehicle and thought, good, with unthinking savagery. Good. If someone has to die here, let it be you. To hell with Gan's navel. To hell with the stories that come out of it. To hell with the tower. Let it be you and not my boy. To hell with the tower, Matt. To hell with the tower.
Yeah.
Holy shit. It just, holy shit. As if there is no thing Roland could say in this moment that would make it more clear how heartbroken he is right now than renouncing the tower in this moment.
Yeah. Just completely completely heartbreaking. Yeah. I mean, I was very sad in this moment. It's so sad to see, I mean, the event of itself. And again, as we talked about with Eddie's death, the reactions of the characters is what really breaks your heart. And as filled with grief as he was over Eddie's death, this, I think, is much worse of a blow for Roland.
Yeah, I mean, not to reduce Eddie at all, who is my favorite character in the story, who I love to death, and not to reduce Jake at all, who is a wonderful character. But to me, Eddie's death always felt like Stephen King punishing me, the reader, and Jake always felt like Stephen King punishing Roland, the character. I like Jake, but I was always much closer and identified much more with Eddie. And so, like, I am sad that Eddie is gone. To kind of contradict something we said last week, I am sad Eddie's gone because I love Eddie and I love his presence in the story. I am sad that Jake is gone specifically because of the way that it breaks Roland and it breaks Oy. That is the tragedy of Jake's death to me. Again, and I'm not throwing any shade on Jake, who I think is a marvelous character in his own right, but it is very specifically the moments that break me in this are Jake or are Oy and Roland, and just like they're just broken. They're just broken.
Yeah, right. I agree 100% with all of that, and I think, you know, if you take Eddie out of the story, I think, you know, like we said earlier, it's kind of almost not the Dark Tower anymore, or in terms of how it feels. You take Eddie and Jake out of the story, man, we're back to the gunslinger, right? We're back to, I mean, we're about to get some moments in a minute here that are just like, wow, okay, he's doing this on purpose. We are back to the gunslinger. And that feels sad in its own right. We're like, oh, like we've lost, there's so much loss that we've regressed back to this version of Roland that we didn't even really like that much, if at all. We kind of admired certain qualities that he had, but didn't particularly like him. And without his loved ones, he kind of becomes that again, you know?
Yeah.
This is heartbreaking.
It really is. I love this line where Jake says, "If Ka will say so, let it be so," which is something that Roland had been thinking just a moment earlier. And it's just like the ultimate knife twist here. It's just like, I think it's so important to frame Jake's death here because it is so, first of all, it's incredibly different from the way Eddie died, right? We talked about this last week, and when we were talking about the heroic sacrifice death versus the senseless death that is Eddie Dean. Matt, this is all I was thinking about. Like, I was talking about other stories and other things, but I was thinking about Jake's death because this is what this is. This is the very typical heroic sacrifice death. Jake has sacrificed himself to save the world. And that death feels different. It feels different to us, the reader. Yeah. But we have this moment where Jake is just like, when Jake died the first time, he was angry. He was bitter. The last words he said to Roland were, "Go then, there are other worlds than these." It was like this punishing, like, fuck you for doing this to me. Yeah. And in this moment, the last thing he says to Roland here is, "If Ka will say so, let it be so. See the man we came to save." Which is just, it shows how different it is. Yes, Jake still has to die. That is what Ka has written. It's got to be, but this could not be a more different death than the first time. And I think that's so significant here that Jake recognizes that he's not like, Jake was a character who was kind of always a little bit afraid that Roland would sacrifice him for his tower. He was always a little afraid that Roland would do that. And Jake is enough of a mind reader that when Roland thought to himself, "No, it's going to be me this time. It's going to be me." Like, there's no doubt in my mind that Jake picked up on that, right? That he was aware enough of Roland's internal thought process that he knew that's what Roland planned to do. And he said, no, basically. He saw Roland go down and knew, oh, okay, this is exactly what I feared. I knew this was going to happen. I have to. And so it's him choosing the death. It's him choosing to fall down that cliff in the mountain. It's him choosing to do that instead of it being chosen for him.
I think partly for the tower and partly for his father.
Yeah.
I mean, I think at this moment probably more to say, well, if it's going to be one of us, it's going to be me, and him making that decision. Yeah, it's yeah, that, I mean, I agree. That's very interesting. It's very interesting to contrast the two deaths. I mean, another contrast, which we're going to get to in just a second, is just the fact that Eddie gets a prolonged, touching base with everyone, or a really beautiful, heart-wrenching scene where he gives his last thoughts to everyone, and Jake just passes away off screen, literally.
Yeah, next to like talking to a woman he just met. Yeah. Speaking of Irene, I really like this moment where she picks up Roland's revolver. First of all, that he just dropped on the floor, which is a very un-Roland-like thing, right? I think is another way that King is demonstrating that Roland is so devastated by this event that he's just like stopped behaving like himself. Like Roland's guns are an extension of his arm. We've always been told this, and it's just lying there, and he doesn't care about it. So Irene picks this thing up and threatens Brian Smith with it, makes him roll off King's body. I think that's a really wonderful moment, and I love that Roland sees her doing this, and like the first thing he can think of is like, why wasn't this woman given Gan's story and not this shitty Stephen King person?
Yeah, God, I mean, and this is one of the many beats throughout this chapter where you have to think to yourself, like, this is Stephen King saying this to himself.
Yeah,
and they're basically going to have like a yelling match in a second, which I thought was really powerful. But that's Stephen King talking to himself. That's literally on these pages struggling with himself, and a part of himself warring with another part. And I always find that to be incredibly moving.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, that's what's happening right now. Roland approaches Stephen King and he approaches him with the grief and fury of any parent. He didn't like King before. Now he fucking hates him. He opens this thing with, one of my friends is dead, another may be dying, and the tet is broken, all because one lazy, fearful man stopped doing the job for which Ka intended him. It's just fucking brutal.
Yeah.
King here says that he lost the beam, but Roland like immediately calls him out on it. It's like, you didn't lose it. It was always there. You just turned away from it. Once again, calling him on his bullshit. Like Stephen King is peppered with excuses, and Roland's like, and I love like something very wonderful that King does here is Roland switches into these and thous when he's chastising Stephen King here, as if like he recognizes the importance of this conversation and of the person to which he's addressing, and like goes to this like formal type of speech, this Manny type of like holy speech where he switches to those these and thous. I found that really powerful.
Yeah, because he's essentially talking to like a holy vessel of some kind, but even though he's going to be respectful in one way, he's still furious and not forgiving him at all. I think I think mostly the King character is just kind of taking this abuse, but it's really interesting to me how I think it's the last bit that King actually says here while he's hypnotized is he just kind of throws it back in Roland's face, and he's like, finish the job. He's kind of, look, I'm going to do my part. I promise. Now you fucking do your part, which is really interesting to me. And I'm like, okay, I mean, he's your character, so.
Sure. He is, but like, as King has talked about characters before, they really take on a life of their own, and the decisions they make aren't entirely yours. It feels like all the time.
True. That is true.
So speaking of which, he does hypnotize King, and again we get lots of wonderful lore stuff. I love this part here. Are you Gan? He asked abruptly, not knowing why this question came to him, only that it was the right question. No, King said at once. Blood ran into his mouth from the cut on his head, and he spat it out, never blinking. Once I thought I was, but that was just the booze. And pride, I suppose. No writer is Gan, no painter, no sculptor, no maker of music. We are Casca Gan, not Ka Gan, but Casca Gan. Do you understand? Do you ken? And this, of course, translates to the prophets of Gan, the singers of Gan, but not it himself. Stephen King, like, once again is chastising himself, but also has this humility. Like, no, we don't create these things. we're just the prophets of it. We're the singers of it. This is very Tolkienian, by the way. We haven't had our weekly Lord of the Rings reference, but this is very Tolkien. This idea that storytelling comes from something greater than us, and we are just the tellers of that song. I mean, the fact that he makes it a song is very Tolkienian in of itself, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The sub-creation idea, which it does seem, I mean, I think there's been enough beats of that throughout that I feel pretty confident that King is intentionally channeling this idea. I mean, who knows whether he actually got it directly from Tolkien, but it is a very, very similar notion to the one that Tolkien has.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's on his mind at least, because we get this next beat here where Roland is ordering him. He says, "This time you'll sing until the song is done, write until the tale is done. Do you truly ken?" And they lived happily ever after until the end of their days, King said dreamily. I wish I could write that. So do I. So that is literally like the last lines of the Lord of the Rings, or at least that's what Sam says. It's like, I think I found an end to my book, and they lived happily ever after. He lived happily ever after until the end of his days. Like that is literally what Sam says near the end of Lord of the Rings. Yeah. So like that is a very specific designed allusion there. I mean, happily ever after is a general storytelling thing, but that until the end of their days part, I think, is very specifically Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So
yeah, the phrasing for sure.
Yeah.
It's, as you're talking here, I'm thinking about like if I can map this moment onto any particular Lord of the Rings moment, and I'm not really able to. I mean, there are heroic sacrifices, but none map too cleanly onto this. I feel like I don't feel like I've had a firm handle on any kind of real one-to-one Lord of the Rings correspondences ever since the end of Wolves. Mm-hmm. I could probably bear to think about this some more though, because I feel like every time I put my mind to it and really try, I find something fun. But
maybe we'll come back to it. Yeah. So Roland tells King that he must forget all about him being there, and Irene being there, and Jake. It was just Brian Smith and Stephen King on the road that day, which is, of course, an explanation for how things actually go in the real world, right? That this is why they don't remember Stephen King's characters that he created suddenly appearing and saving him. I love this part where Roland warns King that a woman might come to him. She'll be fair. She may speak to you about the ease and pleasure of the clearing. She may call herself Morphia, daughter of sleep, or Selena, daughter of the moon. She may offer you her arm and promise to take you there. You must refuse. So we've obviously spoken earlier about how King like briefly relapsed and started abusing painkillers after this accident. And I think this is King kind of acknowledging that fact here in this story. Like obviously Morphia is very specifically opiate related.
For sure. Yeah, this definitely feels like a reference to that. I mean, textually though, he's basically saying, I don't know if he's literally saying watch out for a woman named Morphia, or if he's saying you're going to think about killing yourself to ease the pain. Don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be like, I think it could be like acknowledging the lull of addiction to ease your pain. I think it also could be acknowledging the lull of suicide to ease your suffering. I think there was a moment there. Again, you haven't read On Writing, I don't think, where Stephen King, I think that's the one place publishing that he goes in the most detail about his post-accident life, but he couldn't write. He was in so much pain that he would sit down in his chair and it would just hurt to sit still for that long to write, and he couldn't do it. And so he at one point almost was like, I'm just going to retire. I'm just not going to write anymore. And so you think a person who writes every day, who writing is such an intrinsic part of their life, going through the emotions of maybe acknowledging that they might never get to do that again. And so I think there is some, I'm not going to say he was suicidal. I'm not going to put that on him, but there's a lot of these feelings and emotions that probably go through a person.
Yeah, I think anybody suffering from chronic pain has at least moments here or there where it occurs to them that there is a way of ending that. But hopefully not for long. Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it's also a reference to the addiction, to the drug. I like a man like him who struggled with substance abuse throughout his life, he probably has some really firm lines in the sand for himself about like what he considers problematic behavior. But like, it strikes me that if a man gets his body smashed by a van going 50 or whatever, like, I'm not going to hold it against him if he uses painkillers and maybe he has a bit of a hard time getting off of them. Sure. I mean, I understand why he would feel like a compulsion to work it into this story as he's dealing with it.
Yeah.
But
yeah. In an interesting twist of fate, and I guess Stephen King was aware of this when he wrote the story, but Brian Smith, the man who hit him, died of an overdose on pain medication. He was taking Prozac and Valium, and like he overdosed and died. And it was on Stephen King's birthday, actually, in the year 2000, like almost a year and a half after he hit him. So it's just like it's one of those weird moments of where the story seems to reflect life and where narrative seems to worm its way into real life. It's just weird. It's weird. It
feels kind of tacky to call it Ka when it's a real person, but like I admit that's the first place my mind jumps to since we're so used to talking about it that way. But yeah, that is very weird. It's very weird.
Yeah. All right. So let's get. I don't want to move on because we're about to get to the really, really, really sad parts. Okay. So he finishes with Stephen King and with Brian Smith, and then he goes back over to Jake. He went to Mrs. Tassenbaum and fell on his knees beside her. Oy sat by Jake's head, now silent, knowing his howls could no longer be heard by the one for whom he grieved. What the gunslinger feared most had come to pass. While he had been talking to two men he didn't like, the boy who he loved more than all others, more than he'd loved anyone in his life, even Susan Delgado, had passed beyond him for the second time. Jake was dead. I kind of love and hate the cruelty here, what Roland describes as a paradox, that he loved Jake so much that he had to make his death mean something, which means he had to go talk to those two men, so he misses Jake's death. Like this cruelty, this paradox that meant that he had to miss witnessing the death of his son. And so Jake's final moments are with this woman he barely met, not his father. I think that's cruel, but it's kind of brilliant in its cruelty, I think. It just really breaks your heart.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, like, whenever I'm reading, part of me is experiencing all the emotions, and part of me is appreciating the artistry that causes me to feel those emotions. And on that level, I'm definitely appreciating the artistry of the moment, of how fucking devastating this is. I don't have, but by the way, I don't have a lot to say during this whole part that we're going to get through. It's just like, yep, that's extremely sad.
Yeah, I don't know how we're going to do this. I mean, I pulled a bunch of quotes and I feel like we have to read them to experience them because that's part of this journey. But I agree with you. I think it's just sad. It's just sad. And it's brilliant writing. It's absolutely brilliant writing. But it's just sad.
Yeah.
So this first one is when Irene is kind of explaining to Roland what he said to her, what Jake said to her as he was dying. She says, "He told me to come back for you after the business here is done." Those were his exact words. And he said, "Tell my father I love him." Roland made a sound, choked and miserable, deep in his throat. He was remembering how it had been in Fedek after they had stepped through the door. "Heil, father," Jake had said. Roland had taken him into his arms then too. Only then he had felt the boy's beating heart. He would give anything to feel it beat again.
Like I said, the book just spends the next little while just punching us in the heart over and over. Yeah.
And I like, this is the second friend of Roland's that's died in a day, in like moments, really.
Yeah.
And the second one that also one of his last words is father. Like he just emphasizing the parental bond there. That is just a choked. Roland made a sound, choked and miserable, deep in his throat. I think that's just a powerful sentence. Like, just like, it's just, you can't even really describe it other than choked and miserable. It's just this, you can kind of imagine him making it, though.
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, Roland, we see him as a fairly stoic character. It's not that he's never cried before in the story, but he's reasonably stoic, archetypal gunslinger. And so to see him just breaking down, you know, kind of being so devastated that you can see it in his physical behavior like this, that really I think connects for us.
Yeah. So Irene leaves, promising to return later to tell Roland the rest of what Jake ordered her to do, and we get this. And now he was alone with that loss, alone with Jake. For a moment, Roland stood surveying the little grove of trees beside the highway, looking at two of the three who had been drawn to this place, a man unconscious and a boy dead. Roland's eyes were dry and hot, throbbing in their sockets, and for a moment he was sure that he had again lost the ability to weep. The idea horrified him. If he was incapable of tears after all this, after what he'd regained and then lost again, what good was any of it? So it was an immense relief when the tears finally came. They spilled from his eyes, quieting their nearly insane blue glare. They ran down his dirty cheeks. He cried almost silently, but there was a single sob, and Oy heard it. He raised his snout to the corridor of fast-moving clouds and howled a single time at them. Then he, too, was silent. It just... Again, we're just going to sound like broken records here, Matt, but it just breaks your heart. I love this. Like, he was sure he had again lost the ability to weep. You know, we've been talking about how this is almost the story of regressing Roland, taking away those things that made him rediscover who he is as a person. And this terrifying feeling he has here that he's regressed so far that he's lost the ability to cry again. What good was any of this if I am just that person I was again? What good? And so I think as much as he is regressing, there is some sense that he has changed, and that change will carry forward, which is good.
I sure hope so. I mean, that I think that's the sense, but also plot wise, I feel like we're moving in a backwards direction. This beat of Oy being there with Roland, I think it's really interesting how Oy being there simultaneously makes it more bearable because Roland is not completely alone, but also sadder at the same time because now you have to watch the sad puppy dog being sad, which is really, so it's just an interesting kind of writing framing to just really just hammer every emotion home for us.
I agree. So Roland carries Jake into the forest to begin to prepare him for burial. He shuts his eyes. This beat, Matt, is so fascinating to me that like one of his eyes won't shut. It's still open, still looking at him. And King describes it as giving the boy an evil wink that must not be allowed. I think that's such a fascinating turn of phrase, right? Like it's one of those weird things in death that it's those unnatural, uncomfortable things that sometimes our body in death just doesn't do stuff. And so he has to like lick the eye shut because he wets his thumb and I think uses that to keep the eye shut.
Yeah, it's a very parental thing too, because it reminds me of like, you know, you got something on your face, your mom licks their thumb and rubs it off, you know?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the imagery here is specifically trying to like infantilize Jake a little bit here because he removes his shirt, which is bloody and dusty, and Roland takes off his own shirt and puts it on Jake, and that it's too big for him. So it's almost like he's drowning in it. He's wearing a shirt that's too big for him, and it makes him look small. It makes him look childish. It makes him look like a baby again a little bit. And that's powerful imagery there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, reminding you that Jake is a child, right? Because I think a lot of the book has been marching you down this road of putting Jake through kind of a premature adolescence, rushing him into adulthood, and reminding you like, no, he's literally not even really an adolescent. And you know, he's a child. It hurts. Yeah.
It does hurt. So he tells Oi to stay. Stay, he murmured to the bumbler. Guard your master. But that was a wrong. Stay and guard your friend. And Oi says nothing in response here, and he leaves him. And Oi stays and guards him. And I love that he snaps the fly out of the air. Like, no, nothing will touch him. He's going to stay clean. And then he goes back just to make sure that Brian Smith and King both took his warnings to heart and don't remember anyone else being there. And we get a snippet of the conversation between the two of them. And I think this is worth focusing on for a bit. King says, "You know who I am." "God, yeah," Brian Smith said and chuckled. He took a bite of the candy bar and talked through it. "Recognize you right away. I've seen all your movies. My favorite was the one about the St. Bernard. What was that dog's name?" "Cujo," King said. This was a word Roland knew, one Susan Delgado had sometimes used when they were alone together. In Magus, Cujo meant sweet one. "Yeah, that was great. Scary as hell. I'm glad the little boy lived." In the book, he didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing, like, the voice actor really does a good job conveying the kind of pain and fear in the voice of Stephen King. It's really upsetting because, like, he's got Brian Smith just like rambling at him affably, and Stephen King lying there in shock and terror and like responding almost like hollowly. I just thought it was really good voice acting performance in that particular moment there.
Yeah.
Also, related to the Cujo comment specifically. So I know from watching like a YouTube video of one of King's appearances that people were so mad at him for killing the boy in Cujo in the book.
Oh, yeah.
He said he got a highly disproportionate amount of hate mail and angry letters about killing the boy.
My dad was ranting about this just 3 days ago to me, where he's just still pissed off at Stephen King. He's like, what the fuck is the point if the kid dies at the end?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, like, I don't remember exactly what King was saying, but like, I think that was when he was younger, and I don't know if he would do that kind of thing anymore. But the thing is, he's reminding us of the moment when he killed the kid and everybody was mad, and here he goes killing the kid again. Yep. So he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows we'll be mad at him. He knows we'll be pissed at him. And by the way, I haven't really said this today, but I'm mad at him because honestly, this felt like a bit of a cheap shot, following so close after Eddie's death. Like I was saddened by Eddie's death. It felt like a good story moment, but I was sad. This makes me mad because I'm like, okay, oh come on, fuck you. Like you're hitting me when I'm down, and I'm sort of doing the thing that I talked about at the beginning of the episode where I'm uncoupling. Where, like, if Susanna dies now, I'm just like, yeah, okay. I mean, I'm being a bit blasé there. I'm sure that if that happens, he'll write it in a way where it's devastating. But part of me is like, yeah, you're probably going to kill Susanna now. That's probably what's going to happen. Like that's
sure.
And I don't know if I'm right or not. I'm just saying, like, when you take the story in a direction like this, when you kill the kid, when you kill the heroic young man, you get bittersweet tears. When you kill the kid, you get angry tears. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a very understandable reaction. I don't. It's not that I like necessarily 100% disagree with you. I mean, I don't think I was quite as angry. I was just devastated. I was just absolutely devastated. I don't think I ever got to the anger point, but I think you're right that people got mad at him for this too. I think that, and you're right that he knows it. And I think having Stephen King say in the book he died is showing, like, in the story itself, Stephen King, the character, I forget what we decided to name him last week. I forgot. Was it like Ted King?
Yeah.
John King?
Jeff or
whatever.
Something. Yeah.
Jeff King. Yeah. I think he's had the memory of what happened erased from him now, hypnotized away. But you kind of get the idea that, like, in some subconscious level, he's still remembering that this kid just died to save him. And so he's thinking about that. And so, like, in the book he died. Like, I didn't read the audiobook, but I just imagine it this very flat, like, reading of this, like, just this very flat, wounded reading of that line as he says it.
It's a great reading. Absolutely. It's it's a good, this audiobook reader doesn't put the same level of, like, character into the characters that Frank Miller did, but he still acts. He still carries the scenes very well.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I do wonder. I think probably different people react to these death moments differently. Like, I do wonder if anybody felt the same way as I did. I know that reading the way we're reading, where it's like 1 week at a time and then we talk about it, that creates that creates a different way that I'm interacting with the text relative to a normal person. So maybe nobody else reacted the way I did, but I would kind of be interested to know if anybody else felt the same as me.
We'll let our listeners know if they got quite as angry as you did. I will say, just to kind of show where my head's at, I thought the kid dying at the end of Cujo was perfect. And I think it does. I mean, I can't explain why without really getting into that story, and we don't have time to do that, but I think it works very well at the end of that book. It makes sense why the kid died, in my opinion. But
sure. I mean, I haven't read it, but I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're objectively correct.
So King gives us this really brief respite from all this grief as we cut over to Irene Tassenbaum. Again, we get to see that as she heads home to switch out this old shitty truck for her brand new Mercedes. And we get this like little, this is one of those things where like King just can't help himself, but like really dive deep into this character. Like, we learn about her home life. Like, we learned at the very beginning that her husband is, at least she says, one of the people responsible for inventing the internet. And so he's this really rich.com guy. And she we see here like she lives at Cullum's old place because Ka has a wheel. We see here that she says like, yeah, if this guy wants to sleep with me, I'm gonna do it. It's just a really interesting examination of this small bit character and like who she is and what her life is and why she's so fascinated by this adventure that she's about to go on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're gonna spend, I think we're retreating from Roland's head because he's just too completely miserable, and so I don't know how much more time we're going to spend with Irene, but it seems like part of it is we need an external perspective on Roland and how he's doing, and we probably need to get to know this character so we understand them as they go through whatever adventures are next on the docket.
Yeah. All right, let's go back to the burial, Matt. So he buries Roland and covers he buries Jake, sorry, then covers his shallow grave with stones, all while Oy stands guard. And we get this he remembers him. Once again, we go back to that night in Calibran Sturgis, right? He remembers the boy standing before the people of Calibran Sturgis in the torchlight, his face young and fair as if he would live forever. I am Jake Chambers, son of Elmer, the line of Eld, the quartet of the 1990 and 9, he had said, and oh I, for here he was in the 1990 and 9 with his grave all dug clean and ready for him. And then he finishes up and says, Oy, will you say goodbye? Oy looked to Roland, and for a moment the gunslinger wasn't sure he understood. Then the bumbler extended his neck and caressed the boy's cheek a last time with his tongue. I ache, he said. Bye, Jake, or I ache. It came to the same.
Ouch, my heart.
Yeah, that fucks me up every time.
Yeah,
every time. It's such a wonderfully constructed thing. Like it doesn't. It probably was just by Jake.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I think Roland is the one who thinks maybe it means I ache, which is how he feels, and
it doesn't matter. Like it came to the same. It's all the same.
Yeah, it's just brilliant writing too, because like I don't know, I would guess that he didn't like plan this. I think it's just like organically in the moment.
Yeah,
realized like, oh yeah, he says ache, which means ache.
Yeah,
which
he says. If you chop off the first word of by Jake, it's I ache.
Yeah. God, yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, mm-hmm. I just want to clarify, like, as I am mad at Stephen King, but it's not like this scene isn't working on me anyway. Like, I'm definitely heartbroken by all this.
Mm-hmm. So then Roland starts his eulogy for Jake, and it's absolutely beautiful. We don't have time to read it all, but I will read, in my opinion, are some of the most beautiful and horrible words and sentences I've ever had the sad misfortune and the immense pleasure of reading. So at the end of the eulogy, Roland says, "This is Jake, who lived well, loved his own, and died as Ka would have it. Each man owes a death. This is Jake. Give him peace. He knelt a moment longer with his hands clasped between his knees, thinking he had not understood the true power of sorrow nor the pain of regret until this moment. I cannot bear to let him go. But once again, that cruel paradox. If he didn't, the sacrifice was in vain. Roland opened his eyes and said, "Goodbye, Jake. I love you, dear." Then he closed the blue hood around the boy's face against the rain of earth that must follow.
Yeah, I just brutal, absolutely brutal, right? Yeah.
That sentence, each man owes a death. This is Jake. Give him peace. I think is so powerful because each man owes a death, right? Each man owes a death. Jake has died 3 times. 3 times Jake has died. And so this, give him peace. Leave him alone. Stop it with this. No more. Let him rest. Let this poor boy that God has swooped up and thrown onto this adventure and killed him over and over and over again. Let him rest. Give him peace, please. Like there's a pleading to that. Like never has rest and peace meant more to me in a moment than in this moment with Jake.
I think you're right there. I was kind of planning on saving some of this for the wrap up, but like I think one of the things that you may be thinking as you're reading this, or maybe you think it after you read this and then put down the book and you're taking a shower and you're like, now hold on a minute. if he's dead on Earth, I mean, maybe he just popped out in Midworld again, you know? And it's like, that would feel quite weird after all of the drama that has been invested in this moment. And I think maybe King is directly kind of lampshading the idea that like, hey, we're burying him now. This is a funeral. He's gone now, you know?
Yeah. I not to pop your theories bubble, but I think King makes it pretty explicit here that like, if you die in Keystone World, that's game over. That like Jake died in another version of Earth created by a story. And so those rules work differently. You die in this place, you donezo.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what he's doing here. Like he's giving us closure in a way that we didn't get before, and it would feel weird, and it would feel super weird if Jake were just like back. Wait a minute, we just had all of the crying and the funeral. And okay, well, I guess Jake's back now. Okay, whatever. Nothing means anything. You know.
Sure. Yeah, that would rip this moment out of and make it useless and weird. And that's I would get angry at Stephen King if that happened.
Right. Oh, Eddie's back to life too. Great. Let's go shoot the Crimson King in the face, guys. Yeah, this is going to be a great wrap up to the saga. Yeah. No, I mean. Yep. But yeah, no, I think he's sort of signaling that here, that we're not gonna, you know, yes, let him rest. Come on, guys, let him rest.
Yep. So Roland heads back to the road to wait for Irene to return, and I love this moment where he thinks, and we think Oy might not come with him, that Oy might just. Roland says he might just sit there at the boy's grave until he starves to death or is killed by some predator, and you think that maybe that's gonna be the way, but Oy does come. We learn later that Jake gave him a command, and Oy will honor that command, whatever it is. We don't know what it is, but
yeah, which is interesting. It's interesting that there are still sort of secrets here, and that there are also things that Irene knows that Roland doesn't know yet, right?
Yeah.
So see what all that is. Yeah,
Irene does show up. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say I suspect that what Jake told Oy was something about protecting Roland from Mordred, because that was the other directive that Eddie gave him, and Jake never had an opportunity to protect Roland from Mordred, so it kind of has to be Oy who takes on that role.
I just want to point something out here that you might not have remembered from last week's reading, but when that young Breaker girl kissed Jake on the lips, the text specifically said Jake would remember that kiss for the rest of his life, which he did.
Yeah.
It was only like 45 minutes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That sucks. Yeah.
And it was very hard to read that part. And I was pulling that out specifically because I knew it would be a twist of the knife for everyone that knew what was about to happen. But also like when Ted is like, you'll judge all the rest by the first one. And like, there won't be any more.
Yeah.
It's mean, Steven.
God damn it. See, that's what I mean. I'm mad. See, you're mad too. I'm mad. I'm just not as mad as you are. You just can't. You just love Stephen King too much.
I've had years to process this, Matt. So I'm doing okay.
I think we were literally in college when you first told me about your conflict with your dad over the Dark Tower. So
every time. You know how it started this time? I was seeing my parents this weekend, and I said, "Hey, Dad, Stephen and Tabitha King are celebrating their 50th anniversary this year or today." And then my dad went on a rant about the Dark Tower.
God.
And then also worked in his hatred of Cujo at the same time. And like the thing about this is every time it happens, I will engage my dad and I will make the arguments and I will scream at why he's totally wrong. And the rest of my family is just like, are you guys fucking doing this again? Are you doing this again? Yes, we are, Mom, because he's wrong.
This is great, and as we discussed, you've basically done this podcast as a way of enlisting another party to be on your side. So
yeah. So I mean, if you betray me at the end of the line, I'm going to be real upset here, Matt.
Well, that's a lot of pressure, actually.
I think we'll be fine. So Irene does come back and basically tells Roland that Jake says he has to take him to New York to find a door to get back to Fedek. But first she asks him what he would like planted at Jake's grave. And of course he says a rose. Mm-hmm. And he looked up for the first time since Jake's death, he smiled. Yes, he said a rose. That just hurts.
Yeah.
So we're quickly approaching the end of this week's reading, Matt. We've got a few things to do here. The first thing is they're driving to New York City. They stop at a hotel, and Irene honestly expects Roland to take his own life. She's kind of laying in bed waiting to hear the gunshot of him taking his own life. But I think that's something that we know Roland would never do. Like he would never do that. But he is unable to sleep, and we get this absolutely heartbreaking line here. I'm afraid to go to sleep, he said. I'm afraid my dead friends will come to me and that seeing them will kill me.
Yeah.
And he's got so many dead friends.
Yeah. It's almost a childlike sentiment. It makes him seem, vulnerable. And
oh, yeah. This is the most vulnerable he's ever been to anyone, ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
right.
She sleeps in bed with him until he falls asleep that night, because that's the only way he'll fall asleep is just with someone else.
Yeah. Just watching him be so miserable is just as painful as anything else.
Yeah. And then, of course, the next night, the night before the two get to New York City and part, they make love. And it specifically says not because he wants to, but because he knows she does. It says here, she took only a single room, and that night he made love to her, not because he exactly wanted to, she sensed, but because he understood that it was what she wanted, perhaps what she needed. And we get this feeling that he's not even there consciously. He's off hearing the voices of all his dead friends. And this is where I think we get to the clearest moment of the story kind of doubling back on itself. And I know you had kind of mentioned this to me before we started recording, so I wanted you to give the opportunity to like talk through where your head's on with this.
Yeah, I think the idea that in this moment, once again, we find Roland alone and friendless, except for a loyal animal, which back in the Gunslinger was a pack mule or donkey, I don't remember exactly, and he's taking some measure of comfort in the arms of a woman who has a scar, which is mentioned prominently. With Allie, it was a scar on her face. With Irene, it's a scar on her breast. We're really echoing to this moment very, very early Gunslinger, back to the beginning, And, I'm sure we can find other parallels if we think about it.
And I mean, not to say he did not take pleasure in his lovemaking with Allie, but it was with her specifically more about her wanting it than he did.
Yeah, it was.
She wanted him.
She wanted him. That was like her form of payment she demanded for him staying there, basically.
Yeah.
Like, okay, but you have to have sex with me, and yeah, and he was like having an okay time, but mainly just kind of passing the time.
Yeah,
was I think the impression that I remember.
Yeah, he's so miserable. He's so awful here, and it's just I think it's such a powerful image to recall Allie, because you're absolutely right that this was a version of Roland that we were torn on at first. Like, we like him as this badass symbol of like the man with no name, but he just wasn't. He didn't feel human, and to be specifically channeling that here is a little terrifying.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what we're going to do with the rest of this book, of which there are many pages. In fact, I think that's what I want to wrap up on, because I have a lot of notes here at the end, but I actually managed to work all this stuff into the conversation already.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wanted to say, so first of all, I was right. Specifically what I mean is, like, I had said what I want to happen. So I was half right. I was right in a way that gives me no joy, actually, because what I had said was I want them to get to the Dark Tower, but then Roland realizes that he refuses to make he refuses to sacrifice Jake, or he refuses to sacrifice one of his friends, and despite being on the cusp of the Dark Tower, he turns away, and he's able to to save his humanity. And so we did get the moment where he turns away from the Dark Tower, and he denies the Dark Tower, and he says, no, if I would rather die than sacrifice Jake. And we do get that moment, but then it's immediately robbed from us, right? And so that leaves me in a place of really not knowing where we are thematically, because that was a prediction that was basically a prediction from theme, not from plot. It was like, well, okay, what is this story about? Okay, it's about second chances and sacrifice and love, and all of these things kind of vector toward the idea that, well, it's Roland's going to have to refuse to sacrifice someone, and that's going to be a crux. And it was, but then it was stolen from us. And so now I'm like, okay, well, where are we going? And I've lost my thematic heading. I think it's really interesting because in this moment, the book has kicked us back to the beginning. The book has sort of said, all bets are off. We're starting over in a certain sense, we don't know what we mean exactly by that, but I think we're meant to feel lost, and I feel lost. And so yeah, that's where I am right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important thing to mention here at this point of the book. The threat has been neutralized. Mm-hmm. The breakers are not breaking anymore. The beam is safe. Both beams are safe. There were two threats. We were very clear, established that there were two threats that if both left unchecked, the tower would fall. Both have been neutralized. The tower is safe. The beam will rebuild itself eventually. Shimi told us that last week. Then they came and saved the beam that Stephen King's death would have torn down. So that threat is removed as well. Yes, the Crimson King is still out there. Yes, Mordred is still out there somewhere. But the direct threat of the falling of the tower happening any moment now is gone. So what's next? What, like,
exactly
Roland says here, like, the paradox of the situation is, if I don't leave Jake's side, if I don't go back to Midworld and continue on my quest, his sacrifice will have been for nothing. But that's, like, that's all I can say. But
yeah,
what is there left to do, Roland?
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think, like, sorry, Roland. I think he was sacrificing himself just so you could live. I don't know if he really cares all that much if you get to go see the Dark Tower. Maybe he does, but I don't think that's why he sacrificed his life. He sacrificed his life so his father wouldn't die. and yeah, like I don't know, it's I mean, the only thing we're missing is a man in black for him to chase across the desert to just kind of put us right back on the path of like, okay, the mission appears to be that Roland is going to the Dark Tower, and that's the mission.
Yeah, I mean, I think to reemphasize, I think we have some dangling plot elements, right? We do have the Crimson King, we do have Mordred, we have this Dandello thing that was introduced to us that we really don't know what to do with yet. But from a motivational standpoint, you do have to be like, okay, are you just going to go to the tower now because like that's what you were doing? Yeah. Like in remove of all other goals, all other obstacles, it's like, okay, we're just going to keep going on. We don't know. And I think that's kind of the exciting, it's an exciting place to be in the story where you're right. We have about 300 pages left in this book. And what's left? Yeah, what is there left?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. There are dangling plot threads, but I don't have a sense of direction, right? Mm-hmm. Like, okay, I see, Mordred, something with Mordred, but where are we going? Like, this is a series actually that has had a very, overriding sense of propulsiveness and direction to it, and we've just we've lost that, and I agree that it makes it exciting. Like, I'm not complaining. I'm not like, this is bullshit. I'm like, okay, this is interesting to me because I didn't expect this particular turn of events, and now that it's happened, I'm really not sure what's gonna follow. It's
well, and I think there's a part of you that wants to see what's up at the tower, right? Like you want to get to the tower and see what's going on there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's true, absolutely. But yeah, I just don't know what we're going to fill 300 pages with. I'm sure it's going to be weird because that's the one thing I know about the rest of the Dark Towers. Everybody says it's weird, but like this story moment feels really strange to me. So
yeah. Well, we'll figure it out next week or the week after or the week after that.
Or
we're heading to the finish line, Matt. This is episode 7 of 12 here. So we've got 5 to go in the Dark Tower.
Wow. Yeah. You put it that way. That is very exciting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool.
And that is it for this week. We will be back next week and we will finish up part 3 by reading chapters 3 and 4 of part 3. Veskagan.
Cool.
But before we go, we have to get to our discussion question. And we're shockingly running very, very late in this episode because we stopped and talked about way too many things on the way to the end. So we're going to move through this very quickly. We're going to move away from the sadness that is Jake's death, and we're going to celebrate the life of Eddie Dean, because our question was in honor of the incomparable Eddie Dean. What is your favorite Eddie moment in the Dark Tower? So we're going to move through these very fast, Matt.
Dirkus19 says, so many to choose from, but I guess I'll throw in the time Eddie made the devil set himself on fire. Eddie versus Blaine is primo Eddie, in my ever so humble opinion.
Yes, absolutely. Para Jane says, my favorite Eddie moment is from Jake's perspective, because even before Jake knew Eddie, he admired him. When Jake follows Eddie to the Dutch Hill mansion, he sees him playing with Henry, clocks Eddie's deceptively bad playing immediately. The scene tells us several things. Both Jake and Eddie are uncommonly perceptive. Jake, because he sees that little Eddie is hiding his agility and speed, and that Henry can't see it. And Eddie, because he knows how to manage his brother's anger, emotionality, and emotionally and physically. We learn firsthand through Jake's eyes that for Eddie's entire life, long before heroin came into the picture, he's been hiding his skill so as not to stoke Henry's ire. Most importantly, we see the nascent gunslinger in the 12-year-old's fast, agile, smart, capable of instant, accurate observation and intuitive leaps. That connection between them is unmistakable. If they'd been two kids meeting on the basketball court under different circumstances, they'd have clicked more closely than Jake and Benny. They'd have been instant friends from different worlds, and their friendship likely wouldn't have lasted given the interference of the distance, the Piper School, and Henry. It's lucky for all of us that Dada Chum, Dada Chi, Eddie got the key.
That's great. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, me too. Man of Zimmer selects the same scene, but for different reasons. They select the game of basketball. They say they love the detail of the King uses to illustrate sibling rivalry and love. Eddie, being the younger but more talented one, uses his skill to artfully miss the layup and give his pathetic older brother the win. Eddie knew that he could beat his brother, but the smarter move was to throw the game and let him take the victory and keep his pride. I too have a younger and more talented brother that I suspect has let me win at hoops. At the time that I discovered the Dark Tower during a summer break between college semesters when I was 19, obviously, there were a lot of strange connections between my life and Eddie's. I've had my own run-ins with addiction, thankfully not of my own, but my father's. As an older brother who was forced to shoulder the load of caring for and helping to raise my younger brothers, Eddie's story always hit home. And then Man of Zimmer goes into some more, very touching personal details about how his life story relates to Eddie's. And yes, it I think, I also have a younger brother who's more talented than me, and so yeah, I can relate to those feelings as well.
I have a younger sister who's more talented than me, so it's samesies, kind of.
Yeah, sure. It's the same package of emotions, I think.
I do love the ways in which, like, I feel like everyone we talk to about Eddie has these immensely personal reactions to Eddie, that they identify a lot of themselves in Eddie. And I think one of the things that Stephen King is very good at is creating these very specific characters that are universally understandable and identifiable. And I think Eddie is one of the best examples of that to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, next we have HCVC, who says, my favorite Eddie moment is when he threatens Jack Andolini in the bookstore. I realized how badass Eddie had become from the eyes of a non-gunslinger and was basically jumping around in excitement seeing him do that.
Yeah, that was so fun. Yeah,
it was. The funny thing about that is I know we said we were going to move through these quick, but I have something to say. I've been re-listening to The Drawing of the Three on audiobook as I go to sleep each night. Like, I listen for about 20 minutes as I'm falling asleep, because I said after last week where I can just open up that book and Eddie Dean's alive again. Well, that's what I did. I did that, and Eddie Dean's alive again. And I think the moment where he stands up to Jack Andolini is this badass, look how far Eddie has come moment. But it surprised me how similar it was to how much he's willing to stand up to the customs agents in that book. Uh-huh. It is true, Eddie grew and became more self-assured and more confident and more badass. But that steel, as Roland identifies right when he first sees him, was just always there. He was always capable of that. He just had to learn to let it out fully.
Yeah, I love that. That's true. Good point. John Dex 1980 says, my favorite Eddie moment is probably each and every time he calls out Roland for his bullshit and fundamentalist behavior. From the start, he was the ultimate foil for Roland, and I always loved when he stepped up and called him out like no one else would.
Great. Fast Randall says, I'm going to kind of cheat and answer last week's question. Oh, well. My favorite Stephen King moment this year was rereading The Drawing of the Three and seeing Eddie Dean again. Oh, so you came right back around to following the rules. Uh-huh. Good job, Fast Randall. It's very fast of you, Randall. So when he first appeared in the book, I was shocked by how much I missed him and excited I was to journey with him to the tower again. He is truly the heart of the quartet, and I think one of the things that makes this part of the book so sad is that Eddie is the most equipped to heal the quartet after such an earth-shattering loss. Eddie always seems to be the one connected with each member of the quartet when they need it most. In a lot of ways, Eddie's the glue that held the quartet together. Yeah, that's such a good point, because I just remember when they were trying to decide which they do first, right? The Devartoy or Stephen King. And you just feel like if Roland had lost Jake with Eddie still around, Eddie might have been able to help him deal with it in a way that he just doesn't have anyone to do that for him now.
Yeah, definitely. In many ways, Eddie was the star player of the quartet. Mm-hmm. Full Fathom 5 says, my favorite Eddie Dean moments are all the times we see him dealing with and overcoming the abuse he has endured from Henry. It's something that I remind myself and my students. We are the sum of our experiences, not just what happens to us, but also what we do with what happens. Awful things can make us better people. When it comes time to talk the devil into setting himself on fire, Eddie finally has a moment when thinking of Henry reminds him of something good, and we get to see how strong he is in spite of, or maybe because of, his constant psychological tiptoeing dance with his brother.
Well said. I love that as well.
Yeah, that's remarkably good, because you totally do buy in that moment that someone with Eddie's steel takes Henry's abuse and just uses it as fuel.
Mm-hmm. Drew Dandelion says, The most honest and true answer I can give is my favorite Eddie Dean moment is every single moment that he speaks. Every single Eddie dialogue moment, external and internal, is absolutely 100% perfection. There are people who need people to need them. The reason you don't understand is because you're not one of those people. You used me and then tossed me away like a paper bag, but bag if that's what it came down to. God fucked you, my friend. You're just smart enough so it would hurt you to do that, and just hard enough so you go ahead and do it anyway. You wouldn't be able to help yourself. That's a quote that Drew shared from Eddie Dean. This is one of my favorites, but seriously, every single fucking line.
Yeah, God, I can already tell I'm going to love rereading this book. Because that, just that statement ties so much into all the stuff that we've been talking about. So.
Yep.
Big Combination says, my favorite Eddie Dean moment would have to be his introduction, clearing the customs, and the fight in the Leaning Tower. While I can appreciate a grim slog if it's done well, do you ken R. Scott Baker? Eddie's introduction takes the gray and bitter tale of Roland and makes it fun. King has such a fantastic capacity for wit and joy that it would have been criminal not to include those elements in his magnum opus, and Eddie is that fun side of King personified. Seeing as King already brought Oz into this, I think it's only right to draw this parallel. Eddie's introduction is the moment the story goes from black and white to radiant, blazing Technicolor. While there are many great Eddie moments in the books that follow, none resound as strongly with me as those first moments when Eddie's goofy charisma debuts and completely transforms the character of the story. Yes, I love that. That's a fantastic visual image of,
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, Roland opening the door into the airplane being akin to the moment of color entering the movie. That's great.
That's so good. That's so good. Trumpet Cop says, as my name implies, I'm on the law and order side of the drug equation, but my favorite Eddie Dean moment is probably his first big smart-ass scenes with the customs agents. You're immediately on his side, even though on paper, as a dope runner, he's the guy we're supposed to disdain. But because Roland is our guy, so is Eddie, by default. Yeah, like I said, I just re-listened to that scene like last night, and it's just real fucking good, man. It's just so sharp and witty and quick, and it's everything that I love about Stephen King.
That's great. It's delightful. Yeah. So all 84001 lists several. I think we're just gonna have to pick a few of these. Eddie Dean is a smorgasbord of favorite moments, they say. The moment the moment when he gets the better of the sallow thing in Nassau. Which now I'm wondering if that was like supposed to be a low man or something. But anyway,
I think you're overthinking that a little bit there.
I don't know. So we're gonna have to do a second read through podcast, Scott.
Well, Jesus! Right. Don't say that out loud. They're gonna actually want you to do it, Matt.
I know. When his brother Henry confuses lemons for lemmings and he doesn't call him out on it. When Eddie was never taught to lean forward when sitting on the toilet, so he can't open the airplane bathroom door. When Eddie meets a beautiful woman in a wheelchair, you better believe he falls in love with her hard. Eddie can fucking whittle like nobody's business. Eddie recognizes when his din stage dives like Johnny Ramone. Eddie can shoot the eyes out of a messenger robot with ease. And he wants a po' boy, and it better come with extra mayo. And just how he rips your heart out, I think is the last one.
I love the way he finishes this. Eddie Dean will never see the Dark Tower, and it's up to us to decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah,
I love that.
That's cool. Yeah.
Karina 2020 says, I have two moments. First, the gunfight in the Leaning Tower. He gets Roland's respect right away by fighting naked, and I love the shit talking. Second has to be his last words to Roland, thanking him for the second chance and calling him father. The gratitude that Eddie shows Roland is so humble. It shows King's devotion to his own sobriety and gratitude for his recovery. I have had addicts in my life, and the ones in AA or other programs show the same gratitude and don't take it for granted. I know Eddie never took his recovery for granted and was grateful for the life of sobriety that Roland offered.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Dark Gazing says, Hail Eddie Dean of New York. May the clearing at the end of the path hold all the poor boys and wise fucking elves your heart desires.
Aww.
My other favorite thing about Eddie, after naked gunfights, is his natural ability as a quip slinger. He's responsible for half of the memorable quotes in this series and certainly the funniest. See the turtle ain't he keen? All things serve the fucking beam. It's sad that finally that fast-talking mouth has met its end, but as you say, Scott, we can open up a drawing of the three and Eddie Dean is still alive and talking smack.
And you should all do it. Everyone go back and read Drawing of the Three between this episode and next. Just go do that real quick.
Okay.
We have Leah, who says, Eddie Dean is my favorite dark character in the Dark Tower series, so picking out a favorite moment is hard. That being said, the thing that stands out to me the most about Eddie is his humor. His sarcasm and quick wit are second to none, and there is so much light and beauty to his humor that it shows even Roland that it's okay to laugh, even in tough times. One of the most memorable moments about the impact of Eddie's humor for me actually comes from Roland in The Wastelands. And Leah goes on to describe the scene in The Wastelands where Roland makes a joke for the first time, which is just like this wonderful moment. Leah says, Roland making a joke. This is a beautiful moment for the group, and I don't think it would have ever happened without the influence of our wonderful Eddie Dean.
Ah, God. That just reminds me how much more like human and relaxed Roland had become over the course of all of the books until all of his friends just died. So
yeah,
great.
Yeah.
Darian Tyros said, we definitely did this question before.
Thanks for calling me out.
Apparently. But, it's we should ask it again at the end of the series. Anyway, they say the answer is his absolutely incredible triumph over Blaine. His quiet deliberation right up to the moment he starts melting Blaine's circuits with his nonsense jokes works so well. Goodbye, Eddie, and say thank you for everything. Alas, we must press onward.
All right. We must press onward with Unplugged Gem, who says, the one that I love that really encapsulates Eddie's personality is when he skips rope in the Calla. I did not expect him to know how to skip rope. No guys knew how to skip rope when I grew up. I would have been about 11 in 87. If they did skip rope, they'd be called sissies, but most likely something worse. I remember that high when the rope was slapping and everyone was chanting and you dreaded being the one to make a misstep and ruin it. It's quintessential summer to me, and I love it. R.I.P. Eddie. See you on my next trip to the tower.
Yeah, that was a great moment. That was beautiful. And I distinctly remember him like looking at Susanna and thinking like things will be over between us soon. And I guess he was right.
He was right. He knew, but he'd love her anyway because that's what Eddie fucking Dean does.
Yep. John says, there are just so many, it's hard to pick, but every time I think of Eddie, I think of his quote, see the turtle, ain't it keen? All things serve the fucking beam. People love that one, I guess.
I love it too. It's so good.
Yeah.
Levi says, my first Stephen King book was The Shining, which my brother had left on a shelf too low for my 13-year-old hands to reach, and off down the rabbit hole I went. After burning through that book, I was ravenous for more, and lo and behold, the very next King book to hit my hands was Wolves of the Calla. The final argument at the beginning was just too juicy to put down. My original read order was 5, 6, and then only a 2-month wait between when I finished 6 and when 7 came out. Then I read Gunslinger through Wizard and Glass and all the way to the tower again. So I did get damn lucky with the release of 7. But by the time I met Eddie on the plane, I had already seen him enter the clearing. And you know what? It made my journey all the more meaningful. That long-winded explanation aside, Eddie always appealed to my 13-year-old mind, and as such, I'm picking the scene in Balazar's office when Eddie gets searched for coke. And then he goes on to quote that scene, which is just quintessential Eddie humor.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Eric T says, I don't know if I'm really scared of heights per se so much as edges. Looking out and down with nothing there but space makes my stomach just drop. Standing at the edge of a building or seeing someone hanging off the leg of a helicopter are terribly uncomfortable. The bridge to Lud was really just a steel cable tightrope swaying in the wind and freaked me the crap out. It had the same impact on Eddie. So when he went sprinting across it to save Jake, who had dived to save. Sorry, I'm messing this up. Basically, a chain of people diving to save each other. On top of that, was me giving extra props to Eddie for doing something I would consider just terrifying. He was good against Blaine and crazy hardcore in any number of gunfights, but running and lunging to the side of a round object, however high over a river, is the most impressive and heroic and stupidly awesome thing I remember him doing.
That's great. Steve L says, my favorite has to be how Eddie kept using bum hug for a day or two just to keep Jake laughing. I think that was the point many of us fell fully in love with Eddie Dean.
Yeah. Just his being kind of a big brother to Jake was one of the more heartwarming things. Dan L says, my favorite Eddie moment was his battle with Shardik. I answer this question with brevity, so I can say this. I was hoping the question would be, where were you when the quartet became broken? I was on a biz flight from California to Virginia in 2006 or so. I had put the book down early the night before my departure so I could read the whole battle in my middle seat to enjoy the long flight while ignoring fellow travelers. I think we were over Arizona when Eddie was shot, Texas when he died. So there I was, a 50-year-old male with tears streaming down his face, snot gushing out of his nose, and feeling like an idiot. I felt the costume. I knew something was coming, but like Scott alluded to, when Jake and Susanna say their goodbyes, I was blitzed with their raw emotions thanks to this damn beautiful word slinger. Yeah.
Aww.
Nothing like crying in public due to fiction. That's
it's always awkward no matter what you do.
Yeah. I feel like I'm always in public when I read those scenes. The most tear jerking of scenes. I'm always on a bus or something.
Yeah, I was reading at home this week when Jake died, and I was just in my office reading, and my wife came home like right when I got to the I ache moment. So she just walks in the door all happy and is like, "Hey, what's up?" And I just look up and I'm just fucking crying. She's like, "What is going on?" It's like, Jake died, and she's never read the book. She has no idea what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I don't go anywhere anymore, but back when the world, before the world moved on.
Yeah, of course.
That's what I meant.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for those answers. I really wanted this to just be like just a fun, just like a funeral for Eddie Dean, where we just focus on the great moments that made him an amazing person and an amazing character. And guess what, folks? Next week's question, we're going to do it all over again, only with Jake Chambers. I want y'all to talk about your favorite Jake Chambers moments. I know we haven't done this one before. This is a new one. So talk about your favorite Jake moment. What is your favorite moment for Jake Chambers in this story? I don't think he's quite as beloved as Eddie Dean, although I think people really like Jake. So I'm kind of interested to see which moments y'all pick.
Yeah, I mean, Eddie is like one of my favorite characters of all time, so it's hard to compare. Mm-hmm. But yeah,
sure.
Jake's got a lot of cool moments for sure.
Yeah, let us know. But that is it finally for us here on Kingslingers. Next week, we will continue on with part 3 in this haze of green and gold by covering the last two chapters, chapters 3 and 4, which will conclude that part. So get reading, and then we'll see you can come back.
That's right. Remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod, or you can post on the subreddit on reddit.com/r/doofmedia. You can post about Dark Tower or whatever other media stuff, and you can post in the threads for these episodes to answer the discussion questions.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of fun threads over on the Reddit. I think someone said, which Muppet characters would you have play Dark Tower people, which was hilarious to read. I can't imagine what that would look like, but it was a lot of fun. So yeah, please share and talk and interact Dark Tower wise. I think it's a lot of fun. And if this is the first episode you've listened to, if you were like, I've never listened to this podcast, but I want to listen to these people talk about when that poor boy dies. You should subscribe to us so you can not miss any other episodes. You can find this show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and anywhere else you can find podcasts.
Yeah. And if you like any of our shows and you want to support us, please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. Special thanks this week to several new patrons. I think it must be the new year. People upping their pledges or subscribing. New Doof dancers, Lincoln A, Sam C, and AJ DL, and new Doof troopers, Daniel T, Rogue Squadron Podcast, Zier, Taranti, and J Chan. Wow, welcome everyone. Welcome to the community. Hope to see you around. Hope you appreciate all the cool reward tiers.
Yeah, we have a bunch of bonus stuff that y'all just got, so hope you're enjoying all that fun stuff.
Like Other Levels of the Tower. Our secret podcast where Scott and I just talk about Stephen King adaptations.
Another episode of which is coming next week, a week from yesterday. If you're listening to this the day it came out, that's confusing. Of course, if you cannot afford to donate, we totally understand. It's a crazy world we live in. There's crazy times. We get it. But there are still tons of ways to help us out. I mean, just downloading this is helping us out, but also sharing it on social media, retweeting us whenever we tweet anything is just do that too.
Yeah, just make that your job.
It's fun. Yeah, just that's your job now. Yeah. That's your job now. Retweet. And of course, you can always help us by leaving a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Zuan Song 76, whose name I think they've answered discussion questions in the past as well. I recognize that name. Anyway, they give us 5 stars and say long days and pleasant nights. As a longtime Tower junkie, I am fully enjoying the experience of reviewing the story in the company of both a constant reader and a newbie. The banter and byplay between the hosts is charming and every bit as worthwhile as the deep digging into character, narrative, and world building that make this series great. Despite my numerous trips to the Tower, I hear at least one brand new perspective, piece of background in every episode. Highly recommend. Well, thank you so much, Swan Song. And thank you everyone who has taken the time to leave those rating and reviews. We see those numbers ticking up every week, and it means the world to me every time you guys do that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, that's so kind.
Yeah. All right, we're finally done, Matt. We'll see you right here next week as we go figure out what the hell is going to happen next.
Yeah.
Long days and pleasant nights.
May you have twice the number.